At 2:13 a.m., in a freezing bathroom in Blackwater City, a city where the law is merely decorative, Celine Vey sat huddled on the tiled floor, her lips cracked and bleeding, while the man who had sworn his love for her smashed things in the outer room. She dialed her best friend's number, but the voice that answered was that of a stranger, cold, calm as a windless night. And in seconds, the entire underground city began to stir because of her. If you don't know what happens next, stay until the end. Like and comment the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. The rain that fell on Blackwater City that night wasn't the kind that cleaned anything. It hammered the asphalt in thick, angry sheets, bouncing off dumpster lids and pooling in gutters already choked with cigarette butts and old takeout boxes. Neon signs bled their colors across puddles, red, blue, sickly green, making the streets look like something out of a fever dream. The city had always been beautiful, the way broken glass was beautiful. You only noticed it if you got close enough to cut yourself. Celine Vey had been cutting herself on this city for 24 years. She was on the bathroom floor when the night officially stopped being survivable by ordinary means. Cold tile pressed against the backs of her thighs through her jeans. She'd slid down against the cabinet under the sink without realizing she'd been moving at all, the way you sometimes sit down hard and only afterward understand your legs had already given up. The overhead bulb flickered. Something had been wrong with the wiring in this apartment for 6 months, and Dax had never called the landlord, and she'd stopped asking him to somewhere around month 4. And in the half-dark, she pressed 2 fingers against her lip and pulled them away wet. Not dripping, just wet. She told herself that mattered. From the other side of the door came the sound of something ceramic shattering, then a chair leg connecting with the wall, then Dax's voice, lower now, which was somehow worse than the yelling. When Dax Mercer went quiet, it meant the performance was over and the real thing had started. She'd known him for 2 years. She'd loved him for about 14 months of that. The other 10 had been a gradual education in the gap between who someone shows you they are and who they actually become at 2 a.m. when the money runs out and the ego starts caving in. He'd been magnetic once. That wasn't just her being stupid about it. People who met Dax in those first months said the same thing. He had the kind of face that camera phones loved, and a voice built for convincing, and he wore success like a jacket he'd owned his whole life, even though Celine later learned he'd borrowed every dollar of it. He'd swept into her world when she was waitressing double shifts at a rooftop bar downtown, and for a while she'd mistaken his intensity for passion. She knew better now. Intensity wasn't passion. Intensity was just possession that hadn't shown its teeth yet. The teeth were very visible tonight. Somewhere around 11, he'd found the duffel bag. She hadn't even tried to hide it. Maybe some part of her wanted him to find it. The packed clothes, the folded stack of cash she'd been skimming from her tips for 4 months, the one-way bus ticket to Callaway Port printed and creased from being refolded too many times. Maybe some stubborn, tired piece of her had been daring him to discover that she was leaving because she was sick of being afraid of the moment and had decided, consciously or not, to just get it over with. He'd stared at the bag for a long time without saying anything. Then he'd thrown it against the wall. Things had progressed from there in the manner she'd learned to anticipate. Escalation following a specific internal grammar, a sentence structure of destruction that always started with objects and worked its way toward people. She'd made it to the bathroom during a gap between sentences. Locked the door. Listened to the lock rattle twice in its frame before he gave up on it and redirected his rage toward the furniture. Her phone screen glowed in the dark. Juno's name sat at the top of her recent calls. Juno Vasquez, her best friend since they were both 17 and working the same summer at a dry cleaning counter on the south end of Blackwater. The woman who had told Celine 6 months ago, with careful words and careful eyes, that she was worried. That Dax was not what he was performing to be. That there were things circling around him, debts, names, business that moved at night, that a person didn't come back clean from. Celine had said she knew how to handle it. Juno had said okay and stayed her friend anyway, which was its own kind of love. Her thumb found the call button before she'd consciously decided to press it. She pressed it. The phone rang once, twice. On the other side of the door, something else broke. Glass this time, a high, clean sound. She pulled her knees closer to her chest and pressed the phone harder against her ear. The line connected on the second ring. But the voice that came through wasn't Juno's. It was male, low. Unhurried in a way that didn't feel careless. It felt deliberate, the way a surgeon's hands are deliberate, every movement already knowing what it intends to do. The voice belonged to someone who had never once in his life felt the need to fill silence with noise. Juno's unavailable. 3 words. Celine's whole nervous system stopped and recalibrated. She pulled the phone away from her face and stared at the screen. Juno's contact, Juno's number, the little icon of the 2 of them at a street fair 2 summers ago. Juno laughing with her head thrown back. She put the phone back to her ear. "Who is this?" Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. A pause. Not uncomfortable. Just measuring. "Tell me who's hurting you." She opened her mouth, closed it. The bathroom door handle rattled once, hard, and her heart lurched in her chest like a dog straining against a leash. Outside, Dax said her name. Once. Flat. Which was the most dangerous version of her name in his mouth. She should have hung up. She knew that, the way you know a lot of things too late. She should have hung up and called 911 and hoped for the best with Blackwater City PD, which was a gamble she'd have given poor odds on any other night. Instead, she said, "Please," and then the door came off its hinges. Not literally, but close enough. Dax hit it with his shoulder, and the lock gave with a sound like a small bone breaking, and he was in the doorway, chest heaving, something cold and flat behind his eyes that she'd learned to read as the worst possible register of his mood. He was still wearing the shirt from dinner. There was a red mark across his knuckles from one of the walls. He looked at the phone. "Who the hell are you calling at?" "Nobody," she said. Reflex. Stupid. He crossed the small space in 2 steps and grabbed for the phone, and she pulled it away and pressed it against her collarbone, and the voice on the other end, that low, even, unhurried voice, said, clear enough that she could hear it, and Dax couldn't. "I heard. Stay on the line." What happened in the next 4 minutes, she would later reconstruct in fragments. Dax's hands on her wrist. Her wrist bending the wrong way, not quite breaking, pain singing up her forearm like a plucked string. She hit him. She'd stopped not fighting back around month 7, reasoning that the bruises she got from fighting back at least came with the satisfaction of having not simply absorbed it. And her knuckle connected with something, his ear maybe, and he swore and shoved her into the cabinet hard enough to rattle everything on the shelves. She ended up on her knees on the tile. The phone had skittered somewhere. She could hear it against the grout, a tiny amplified sound. She grabbed the edge of the sink and pulled herself upright, and Dax was saying something about the bag and the ticket and where she thought she was going, and did she have any idea what she was throwing away, which was a version of a speech she had heard before, and somewhere in her chest something that had been frightened and small and apologetic for a long time made a sound like a drawer closing. She looked at him directly. "I'm done," she said. "I'm completely done with you." His face changed. She'd expected rage. What she got was something colder, a kind of recalculation. He looked at her the way you'd look at a possession you'd decided to break rather than lose to someone else. And his hand closed around her upper arm, and then light swept across the window. Not one pair of headlights. Several. Dax turned. His grip loosened without him noticing. Through the rain-streaked bathroom window, 4 floors down. The street below the building was filling with black SUVs that moved with the kind of quiet efficiency that had nothing to do with emergency services. They didn't have sirens. They didn't have lights. They just materialized out of the rain like they'd been waiting somewhere nearby, which, as Celine would understand much later, was exactly what had happened. Dax dropped her arm completely. "What?" Then the apartment's front door opened. Not knocked. Opened. She heard footsteps in the hallway. Multiple sets. Unhurried, spreading out through the apartment with the practiced ease of people who had done this before and expected it to go a specific way. Dax spun toward the door. He had a gun, she knew. He'd started carrying one about 2 months ago. Another detail she'd filed under things she was pretending not to know, and his hand moved toward his waistband. A man appeared in the bathroom doorway. He was tall enough that he had to tilt his head slightly to clear the frame, and he wore a charcoal overcoat that was dark with rain along the shoulders. And his face was the kind of face that had been sculpted by something harder than ordinary living. Not handsome in the way Dax was handsome. Dax had the surface beauty of something machine-produced, symmetrical, and consistent. This face had history in it, a scar along the jaw, thin and old, eyes that were very dark and very still, and that swept the bathroom in about 2 seconds, cataloging everything. Her split lip, her bent wrist, Dax's hand frozen near his waistband, without any visible emotional reaction to any of it. Two of his men materialized behind him, and Dax's hand jerked toward the gun, and one of the men moved faster than Celine could track. And then Dax was against the wall with his gun on the tile floor and both arms behind him, his cheek pressed against the grout. He was still trying to talk. Something about lawyers, something about did they know who he owed money to, something that was supposed to sound like power, but came out sounding like a man discovering he'd been the least dangerous thing in the room all along. The tall man in the overcoat ignored every word. He looked at Celine. Just looked, for a moment. She was still holding the edge of the sink. Her lip was swollen on one side, and she could feel her wrists throbbing, and her hair was falling out of whatever she'd put it up in, and she was absolutely certain she looked like someone who'd had a genuinely terrible night. She met his eyes because she was too wrung out to do anything else. He reached out and took her hand, her hurt one, gently, with the very specific carefulness of someone who is capable of not being careful and is choosing to be anyway. Fingers closing around hers, not gripping, just present. You're coming with me. She should have said no. She understood that. She should have said no and waited for police and made a report and done all the correct procedural things that are supposed to constitute surviving a night like this. But the correct procedural things had never really been available to people who lived in Blackwater's lower districts, and the police in this city were more interested in staying out of certain men's business than in protecting certain women, and she was standing in her own bathroom at 2 a.m. with blood on her lip and a wrist that didn't feel right, and the man in front of her had come when she called. Nobody else had come. She nodded. He walked her out of the apartment without looking back. The SUV was warm. It smelled like leather and something faintly astringent, a clean industrial smell she couldn't place. She sat in the back with her hands in her lap and watched the rain blur the city into colored smears of light while the vehicle moved through streets that opened up in front of them like something staged. No red lights. No traffic. As if the city itself had been told to get out of the way. She looked at her phone. Someone had picked it up off the bathroom floor and placed it in her hand at some point. She wasn't sure when. Juno's call still showed as connected. "Hello?" she said. "Oh, thank God." Juno's voice came through with the sound of someone who had been holding very still, listening very carefully for a very long time. "Are you okay?" Yeah." The word felt inadequate. "Your brother has my hand." A beat. "I know," Juno said, quieter. "Juno, I'll explain, I promise. Just don't fight him tonight, okay? Just go." The call ended. Celine lowered the phone. The man beside her, Juno's brother, apparently, Juno's brother she had somehow never encountered in 2 years of friendship, was looking out his own window, jaw set, rain tracking down the glass beside his face. A muscle moved in his cheek once. Other than that, he was entirely still. "Thank you," she said. He didn't answer, which she later decided was actually honest, because a man like that would not have come running and burst through doors for altruism. Whatever his reasons were, they weren't simple, and saying you're welcome to something like that would have been a lie. And for all his other qualities, Lucien Vale apparently didn't bother with easy lies. The penthouse was 40 floors up, and it was nothing like she'd expected, which in retrospect was probably because she hadn't known what to expect, and had therefore defaulted to imagining something cold and minimalist and self-consciously designed. What she found instead was a space that felt purposefully inhabited, shelves of books that had been opened rather than displayed, a chess set mid-game on a side table, the kind of organized disorder that comes from a person actually living in a space rather than performing living in it. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the whole wet, glittering sprawl of Blackwater beneath them. From up here, the city looked almost beautiful, almost safe. A woman appeared from a hallway, and it took Celine a full second to process that she was looking at Juno. Juno, who had been somewhere in this building, or who had gotten here somehow. Juno with her hair down and her face worried in the specific way it got when she was trying not to show how worried she was. She crossed the room and wrapped both arms around Celine without preamble. "I'm going to explain everything," Juno said against her shoulder. "But first, can you let me look at your lip?" "I'm fine." "You have blood on your chin." "I'm fine." Celine pulled back and looked at her. You could have told me you had a brother. I have a brother, Juno said, with the inflection of someone who had spent a long time deciding how much of that fact to share with people she loved. Is he... Celine glanced across the penthouse where Lucian stood near the windows with his back to the room, on a phone call, speaking in a voice too low to hear. What is he? Juno was quiet for a moment. The question hung between them with some weight. Complicated, she said finally. Over the next 2 hours, in increments and careful doses, Juno told her what she could. Lucian Vale was 32 years old, and he had controlled the operational underworld of Blackwater City for the last 7 years, first by proximity, and then by succession, and then by sheer accumulated force of will. He hadn't inherited anything. That was the part that made him different from the men who'd come before him, who'd passed power down through families like heirlooms. Lucian had grown up in the Rack, the section of Blackwater's South End that the city's tourism board pretended didn't exist, and he'd understood from approximately age 10 that survival in that specific environment required a type of intelligence that didn't get taught in schools. He'd learned it other ways. He'd built something from nothing and then defended it, repeatedly, with the kind of absolute strategic clarity that people on the wrong end of it tended to describe in terms that sounded more like natural disaster than human choice. Floods didn't have motivations. Fires didn't have reasons. Things in Lucien's path either adapted or stopped. Every politician in Blackwater who answered a call from his number answered it promptly. Every law enforcement entity of consequence had learned, through various instructive experiences over the years, where the edges of his tolerance were. The city breathed at a rhythm he set, and most of its inhabitants didn't know his name. "Why didn't you tell me?" Celine asked. "Because you would have looked at me differently," Juno said simply. "People always do." "Do you think I'm most people?" Juno looked at her with the particular softness of someone who has been protecting something precious for a long time. "No, but I didn't want to test it." Celine was quiet. She turned her wrist over in her lap. It was bruised now, purple spreading under the skin toward the joint, but nothing broken. She'd been hurt worse by this city in less dramatic circumstances. "He's going to want to talk to me," she said. "Probably. About Dax. About everything around Dax." Juno chose her words with visible care. "Dax is not... He's not just a bad boyfriend, Celine, the men he owes money to. They're not the kind of people who what?" The apartment's main room fell silent in a specific way, the way rooms do when someone with a certain quality enters them, a pressure change that isn't quite sound. Lucien had finished his call. He moved toward them and stopped at a distance that felt less like politeness and more like he was maintaining space he'd allocated, a deliberate margin. He had taken off the overcoat. Without it, he looked, paradoxically, slightly more dangerous. A button-down with the sleeves rolled to the forearms, the kind of hands that suggested they'd built things and broken things with roughly equal frequency. The scar along his jaw caught the apartment's ambient light. He looked at Celine with that same flat, cataloging attention she'd experienced in the bathroom. Not unkind, exactly, but not performing kindness either. Just assessment. "Dax Mercer owes $1.3 million to Roman Caldera," he said. No preamble. No softening. "He's been unable to pay for 6 months. Tonight, when you left, Mercer called Caldera to buy time using information." Celine felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What information?" "You." The word landed like the kind of thing you feel in your chest rather than here. "He told Caldera's people that you were leaving the city," Lucien continued, same even voice, same metered delivery, like he was reporting weather. "He offered your location and your route as a show of good faith, something to trade for more time. She stopped. He was going to hand you to men who would have done whatever they needed to do to recoup what Dax owed through other means." A pause. "Caldera runs a specific kind of operation. Transport. Movement of people who are not moving voluntarily." The room was completely quiet. Celine stared at the man in front of her. She was aware that her hands were very still in her lap. She was aware that something inside her, the part that had been telling her for months that it wasn't that bad, that she could handle it, that she just needed to get out quietly and it would be over, had just calculated the full scope of how wrong it had been. So Dax was... She couldn't finish the sentence. For approximately the last 2 years, Lucien said, Mercer has been identifying women for Caldera's network. He has a specific type he favors, isolated, self-sufficient enough to not ask for help, young enough to be... He stopped. You weren't the first. You would have been the most recent. Juno had moved to her side without Celine noticing. She felt her friend's hand on her arm, light and warm, and she did not move because she was doing the math she hadn't wanted to do. 2 years. The charm and the sweep and the dinners and the way he'd very systematically pulled her away from her other friendships, from her family, from the idea that she was someone who could ask for help. The pity she'd been nursing for Dax Mercer, the part of her that had said, maybe he's struggling, maybe he's afraid, maybe he just doesn't know how to be different, turned over in her chest and became something else entirely. Where is he now? She said. Lucien's expression didn't change. Somewhere being made to understand the situation. She looked up at him. And Roman Caldera? That, Lucien said, is the longer conversation. She should have been afraid of him. She knew that. She was sitting in the penthouse of a man who ran a criminal empire, who had arrived at her bathroom door with armed men and had somehow already known her address before she'd managed to explain the situation, who had answered his missing sister's phone at 2 a.m. and within 4 minutes mobilized the kind of response that required significant advance infrastructure. She should have been calculating exits. Instead, she said, "Tell me the rest." Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, more like the recalibration of an expectation he hadn't known he was holding. "Juno," he said, without looking at her. "Yeah," Juno said, and stood up and went somewhere else in the apartment, quietly, the way people do when a room has decided to have a different conversation. Lucien sat down across from Celine. Not beside her, across from her, like someone who understood that proximity required permission and was not assuming any. He laced his hands together and looked at her with those still dark eyes. "Roman Caldera has been trying to take control of this city for 14 months, he said. What Dax gave him tonight, your location, your route, that's small. That's him trying to buy oxygen. The larger picture is that Caldera needs to move his operation north, and he needs the infrastructure I control to do it, and I have refused that. And so he is looking for any leverage point that what?" Lucien stopped. "That makes you move," she said. "He's looking for something that makes you react instead of..." She understood it in the middle of saying it, the full architecture of the problem, and the cold thing in her stomach got heavier. "He knows you came tonight," she said. "Yes, which means he knows it mattered to you, which means..." "He knows you're here," Lucien said quietly. "By morning, he'll know that you matter." Silence. "I'm not leverage," she said. "I'm not..." "No." His voice cut across hers, not harshly, but with a certainty that left no room for the sentence to continue. "You are not, but Caldera will not know the distinction until he tests it." He unclasped his hands. "So you stay here. My people are on every entrance. You are safer in this building than anywhere in Blackwater City tonight. And tomorrow night?" He held her gaze. "I'm working on tomorrow night." She slept eventually, in a room that locked from the inside and had a window that showed the rain-blurred sprawl of the city below, and she lay on a bed that was not her bed in an apartment that belonged to a man she didn't know, and stared at the ceiling for a long time before exhaustion overtook everything else. She thought about the duffel bag she'd left behind, the bus ticket, the 4 months of skimmed tips. She thought about 2 years of careful, methodical isolation disguised as love. She thought about the voice on the phone that had said, with perfect, flat calm, "Tell me who's hurting you." She thought about what it meant that the answer to that question turned out to be larger and more complicated than one man in a bathroom. She was still thinking when she finally went under. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, lying in a locked room 40 floors above Blackwater's rain-soaked streets, was that 3 miles away, in a warehouse near the harbor, Roman Caldera had already received a photograph, time-stamped, taken by a camera positioned across the street from the building, positioned long before tonight had gone the way it went. The photograph showed the entrance to Lucien Vale's building, and a woman with dark hair being walked inside. Roman Caldera set the photograph down on a table and looked at it for a long time, And then he looked at the man beside him, a compact, nervous man with bruised ribs and someone else's blood on his shirt collar. And he said, in a voice of absolute quiet, "Tell me about her." Dax Mercer, who had been calculating odds all his life and finding ways to make them work in his favor, looked at the photograph and understood something: that the only currency he had left in this city was information, and that the man asking the question would collect what he was owed one way or another, and that the only question remaining was what Dax Mercer decided to trade and what he decided to keep. He opened his mouth. And across the city, in a room she'd locked from the inside, Celine Vey had no idea that the war had already decided she was part of it. She woke up at 6:43 in the morning to the sound of someone's boots on hardwood. Not running, walking, the specific unhurried cadence of someone who had been awake for hours and had no intention of pretending otherwise. Celine lay still for a moment with her eyes open, staring at a ceiling that was not her ceiling, in a room where the curtains were the wrong color and the light coming under the door was too bright and organized, not the yellowish half-dark of her apartment on Crail Street where the hallway bulb had been dying for 3 months. Then she remembered all of it, in the way bad things come back when you wake up. Not gradually, but all at once. A full inventory delivered without mercy. The bag, the ticket, the bathroom floor, blood on her fingers when she pulled them away from her lip, and the voice on the phone saying, "Tell me who's hurting you." She sat up. Her wrist ached with a deep, settled pain that told her the bruising had spread overnight. She turned it over in the gray morning light and looked at the purple stain tracking toward her palm. It was ugly. It was also the least complicated thing about her current situation. She found her way out of the room and down a hallway that opened into the main space of the penthouse, which was doing something different in daylight than it had been doing at 3 a.m. Bigger, somehow. The floor-to-ceiling windows showed a city wrapped in low-gray cloud, the harbor barely visible through mist, the streets below quiet in the way cities are quiet very early on mornings after violent nights, like the whole place had gone to bed ashamed of itself. Lucien was at a long table near the windows with 3 other men, and all 4 of them were looking at something spread across its surface: papers, photographs, maps, the kind of assembled material that suggested someone had been at this for hours. The 3 other men were large and quiet, in the specific way of people trained to occupy space without drawing attention to it. One of them glanced up when she appeared. Lucien didn't. "There's coffee," he said without looking at her. "Kitchen's left." She almost said something about being told where the kitchen was in someone else's home. But she was too tired and her wrist hurt too much, and the coffee smelled like the real thing, which her apartment's instant powder had not been. She found a mug and filled it, and stood near the kitchen entry and drank and watched Lucien talk to his men in a voice too low for her to make out specific words. He had the quality of someone who existed at a different operational frequency than ordinary people. Not faster, exactly, but more compressed, like he processed at a rate that left him perpetually several steps ahead of whatever was currently happening and mildly impatient with the pace of everything else catching up. She'd known people who were always busy. Lucien wasn't busy. He was precise. There was a difference she was still working out the terms of. Juno appeared from another hallway in a large shirt and bare feet, looking like someone who had slept about as well as Celine had, which was to say, not well enough and not long enough. "Come sit with me," Juno said, and it was not quite a question. They sat on a low couch near the far end of the room, angled away from the table and the men and the maps, close enough together that their voices could stay low. "How long have you known?" Celine asked. Juno didn't pretend not to understand the question. "About Dax specifically? 4 months." Celine stared at her. "I found out through Lucien," Juno said. "He'd had Dax looked into after—" She stopped, recalibrated. "After I told him about you. After I told him you were seeing someone and that I was worried about how fast it had moved and how much you'd pulled back from things. You went to your brother about my relationship. I was scared for you. No defensiveness in it, just the plain fact worn smooth from having been carried for a while. And he found out what I was scared of was worse than I'd thought." Celine looked down at her coffee mug, the warmth of it against her palms. She tried to think about this, about Juno knowing for 4 months and not saying anything, and found the thinking was more complicated than she wanted it to be, because she had pulled back. She'd become, over 2 years, Someone who deflected questions about Dax with the specific practice smoothness of a person who'd rehearsed the deflections enough times they'd started to feel natural. If Juno had come to her 4 months ago with what she knew, would Celine have listened? Or would she have run the deflections and found some way to stay? She didn't know. That was the honest answer, and it sat in her chest like a stone. I should have told you, Juno said. I know that. I'm telling you now because I know that. But Lucian said if I told you without proof, you'd... He was probably right, Celine said. Juno blinked. He was probably right, Celine said again, quieter. I was not in a place where I was listening. I know that. She turned the mug in her hands. It doesn't make it okay that you didn't tell me, but I'm saying I understand the math. Juno was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry. Yeah. They sat with that. Across the room, the low conference at the table had shifted register. One of Lucien's men was on a phone, and another had moved to a laptop on a side table. And Lucien himself was standing with his hands flat on the table surface, looking at something she couldn't see from this distance. His jaw was set. Whatever he was looking at wasn't news he'd wanted. She watched him for a moment without meaning to. He doesn't sleep much, Juno said, following her eyes. He never has. Even when we were kids, he'd be awake when I got up and awake when I went to bed, and I used to think maybe he just didn't need it. She paused. I think now it's more that his brain doesn't let him. What was he like before? Juno considered the question seriously, which Celine appreciated. Protective, she said finally. He was always... When things were bad growing up, he was always the one standing between whatever was bad and me. That was just what he did. I don't think he ever decided to do it. I think it was just already there. She looked at her brother across the room. The other stuff, the empire, the power, all of it, that was built. The protective thing was just born. Celine looked at her hands. He sent men to my apartment at 2 a.m. because I called a wrong number, she said. He sent men to your apartment because you were in danger, Juno corrected gently. The wrong number was just how he found out about it. Those aren't different things. To him, they might be. Before Celine could answer, Lucien's voice crossed the room clearly for the first time. Not loud, but with the quality of a sound that cuts through other sounds by virtue of its particular register. He'd said something to the man on the phone, one sentence, 3 or 4 words, and the man on the phone nodded and disconnected the call in a way that suggested the call's other party had not been given the option of ending it themselves. Lucien straightened up from the table and looked across the room at Celine. I need you over here, he said. She looked at Juno, who gave her an expression that conveyed approximately, yes, you do, and it won't be comfortable, and I'm sorry in advance. Celine stood up, carried her coffee mug, and crossed the room. The table was covered with what she'd thought were maps, but were actually more specific than maps. Satellite images of buildings, street-level photographs taken from angles that suggested surveillance rather than tourism, printed documents with certain lines highlighted in yellow and others blacked out. Financial records, she thought, though she wasn't certain. Photographs of men in settings that ranged from harbor docks to restaurant tables to what looked like the back seat of a vehicle. One photograph showed Dax. Not from last night. This was older, these different clothes, different venue, a rooftop somewhere, and beside him was a man Celine didn't recognize, who was looking at the camera with the kind of ease that suggested he hadn't noticed it, which meant he hadn't known it was there. That's from 8 months ago, Lucien said, following her eyes to the photograph. Dax and Roman's logistics coordinator. Point being, this relationship is not new. 8 months ago we were... She stopped. Still together, yes. He said it without any particular inflection, as a fact of timeline rather than emotional context. The relationship between Dax and Caldera predates your involvement, but Caldera's awareness of you specifically begins approximately 8 months ago, which is when Dax appears to have identified you as a potential... He stopped. Re-choose the end of the sentence. As someone he could use. Something moved in her chest. She looked at the photograph of Dax and kept her face still. He was laughing in it. Easy, open, movie star laugh she'd seen 100 times across restaurant tables and woken up next to and once, about a year ago, photographed herself and sent to Juno with a caption about how she thought this might be something real. She put the photograph face down on the table. Lucien watched her do it and didn't comment. "Caldera knows you're here," he said. "I said that last night, and I want to be specific about what that means this morning. He knows you were extracted from Mercer's apartment. He knows you came to this building. He doesn't know what your significance to me is, which gives us a window. But that window has a specific and limited duration, and how we use it matters." "What do you need from me?" she said. One of the men at the table shifted slightly. The one named Cord. She'd heard the others use the name earlier without attaching it to a face, and was now attaching it, heavy-shouldered, mid-30s, with the quality of someone who spoke rarely and expected to be heard when he did. Cord shifted and looked at Lucien with an expression that contained some kind of communication she couldn't read. Lucien ignored it. "Mercer," he said. "Last night he was secured. This morning he's talking. Caldera's people got to him before mine could move him." He paused. "Mercer told them you were here. Not as leverage, as information, because Mercer is attempting to survive by being useful, and he is running out of things to offer. So Caldera definitely knows I'm here. Caldera knows. Which means the window closed at approximately..." He glanced at the man with the laptop, who said 4:17, without looking up. 4:17 this morning. Celine looked at the spread of photographs and documents and tried to understand the shape of the problem she was standing inside. What happened to 4:17? "We adjusted our position." Lucien moved around the table and picked up a different photograph. An aerial image of a building she didn't recognize, near what looked like the waterfront. "Caldera is going to move on the building. Not today. He's not impulsive, which makes him more dangerous than men who are. He'll establish surveillance first, understand what he's working with, identify weaknesses. That process takes at minimum 24 hours. He set the photograph down. "We use that 24 hours. To do what? To make you less useful as a target." He looked at her directly. "If Caldera understands that you are not significant to me beyond a practical obligation, a favor to my sister, a woman I extracted from a situation as a courtesy, your value as leverage drops to near zero. He has no reason to expend resources on you if you're just a stranger I did a good turn for." She understood what he was saying. She also understood the part he hadn't said yet. "But," she said, Cord made a sound that was not quite a word. Lucien's eyes moved to him briefly with an expression that was entirely flat and entirely clear in its meaning, and Cord went back to looking at whatever he'd been looking at before. "But," Lucien said, turning back to her, "for that to work, you have to be somewhere other than my building." The room was very quiet. "You want me to leave?" she said. "I want you to relocate to a secondary location that Caldera's network has no knowledge of. You want me to leave your building so that Roman Caldera thinks I don't matter to you. So that Roman Caldera correctly understands that I heard you the first time." She set her coffee mug on the table, carefully, on the edge of the satellite photograph. "And I'm telling you that I have exactly no interest in being moved around like a piece on a board that I can't see." Something in his face shifted, barely. But she was already learning to read the small movements, the almost invisible recalibrations he made when something had gone differently than he'd anticipated. "You're safer?" "I was safer," she said, "before I called Juno's phone by accident. I was safer in a bathroom with a man who wanted to sell me, apparently, because at least I knew what the threat was." She heard her own voice and made a conscious effort to bring the volume down. Not because she was wrong, but because shouting in a room full of his people seemed counterproductive. "If I leave this building right now, what exactly is protecting me from the thing you just described?" "My people would be with you." "Your people." She glanced at Cord, who was studying the table with renewed focus. "Right." "Celine, don't." The word came out sharper than she intended. She saw Juno, somewhere behind her, go very still. "Don't say my name like that, like I'm a person you know well enough to say it that way. We met 6 hours ago." Lucien stood exactly where he was. A muscle moved in his jaw, near the scar, once. "Fine," he said. "The woman who is currently in my building because Roman Caldera's organization planned to traffic her. Is it your preference to stay in this building while I attempt to manage the consequences of that?" "My preference," she said, "is to understand what I'm in the middle of instead of being managed through it." Another silence. This one had more texture in it. Cord had stopped pretending to look at the table. The man with the laptop had stopped typing, and the third man near the window was doing an admirable impression of someone who was part of the wall. Lucien said, "Sit down." "I'm fine standing." "I know you're fine standing. I'm asking you to sit down so that I can show you the rest of what's on this table without you having to lean, because your wrist is going to hit the edge, and it's going to hurt." She looked at her wrist, looked at the table edge, sat down. He pulled a chair around to her side of the table, not close enough to be a statement, just close enough to be practical, and spread several of the documents out in front of her and started talking. Really talking this time, not the carefully edited version he'd been offering since last night. She learned, in the next 40 minutes, the shape of Roman Caldera's operation in a level of detail that made the back of her throat go cold. The trafficking network was not new. It had been running through Blackwater and 2 adjacent cities for almost a decade under several different organizational umbrellas, shifting its legal surface coverage every few years to stay ahead of federal interest. Caldera had taken over its Blackwater branch 4 years ago and had since expanded the operation by approximately 300%, which was the kind of growth that required infrastructure. And the infrastructure Caldera needed, transport routes, port access, legitimate business fronts that moved money without attracting attention, was infrastructure that Lucien Vale controlled. Caldera had approached Lucien 18 months ago with a proposal that Lucien had declined. Caldera had approached him again 9 months ago with a larger number attached to it, and Lucien had declined again. Caldera had begun, over the last 4 months, making operational moves designed to hurt Lucien's enterprises. Not frontally, which he couldn't win, but at the edges, the small pressure points of a network that large, like pulling threads from the hem. Delays at the port, businesses finding reasons not to renew contracts. A low-level manager who'd been with Lucien's operation for 6 years who had stopped answering calls about 3 months ago. And then Dax Mercer. And then Celine. He needed a pressure point that wasn't financial, Lucien said, setting down the last document. He needed something personal. "I'm not personal to you," she said. "We met 6 hours ago." "I'm aware." "So you can just—" She gestured at the building around them. "Send me somewhere. Tell him I don't matter. Let me disappear and clean this up without me in it." "I could do that," he said, "but—" He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light coming off the harbor through the windows was flat and gray, and it caught the angle of his face and showed her the scar along his jaw clearly, and the lines around his eyes that weren't really lines yet but were becoming them, and the expression of someone who was choosing, word by word, exactly how much truth to offer. "Caldera already told his organization that you exist, that you're connected to me. Moving you doesn't change that. It just changes your location. If Caldera decides you're useful as leverage or as a message, your location is a logistics problem, not a protection." He paused. "Which means the variable that actually affects your safety is not where you are. It's what happens to Caldera." She sat with that. "You're saying I'm not safe until he's handled," he said. And then, because apparently he had decided she'd earned the actual word, gone. Celine looked at the photograph of Dax on the table, face down, where she'd left it. She thought about 2 years. She thought about the duffel bag and the bus ticket and the version of the future she'd been trying to get to, which had been small and quiet and had not included any of this. Callaway Port. A room somewhere. A job waiting tables, probably. A life that was hers in the specific limited way of someone starting from zero, but at least starting clean. That future felt very far away and maybe permanently inaccessible. "How long?" she asked. "To handle Caldera." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Days, if things go well. Longer if they don't. And in the meantime..." "In the meantime, you stay here. You don't access your phone for any communication Caldera's network could trace, and you don't do anything without telling me first." She looked at him. "That last part is non-negotiable," he said simply. She wanted to push back on it. She was aware that she wanted to push back on it in the specific way of someone who has spent 2 years having their decisions made for them and has developed a reflexive resistance to being told what to do regardless of the reasonableness of the request. She made herself sit with that for a moment and separate the reflex from the evaluation. The request was reasonable. She hated that it was reasonable. She accepted it. "Fine," she said. Something relaxed slightly in the room. Not Lucien, who continued to hold himself at exactly the same level of tension he'd maintained since she sat down, but the surrounding temperature, the atmospheric pressure of the three men around them, who apparently had not been certain how this was going to resolve. She spent the rest of the morning learning the architecture of the penthouse. There was more of it than the main room suggested. Hallways that branched into smaller workspaces. A room that was clearly a communications center with screens she didn't look at too long. A kitchen that was stocked with the specificity of someone who either cooked seriously or employed someone who did. Juno showed her around with the practiced ease of someone who had visited often enough to know where things were. She asked at one point what Juno did when she wasn't here. Photography, Juno said. Mostly architectural, some portrait work. I have a studio on the north side. Does anyone there know who your brother is? Some people know I have a brother, Juno said. Nobody knows the rest. A pause. You're the first person I've brought here, to the building. Celine looked at her. Ever? In 2 years of knowing you, yeah. Juno said it without sentimentality, just as its own kind of fact. I keep the parts of my life separate. It's safer. For the people I care about. That sounds lonely. Juno smiled, small and crooked. It is, a little. The afternoon was quiet and tense in the manner of all afternoons before things happen that changed the direction of things. Lucien's men cycled in and out of the building in patterns she started to recognize. 2 always on the door, 1 in the communications room, the rotation changing every 4 hours with a precision that felt military even if it wasn't. Cord was always somewhere close to Lucien, which she figured out was not a security detail in the conventional sense, but more like an adjunct. Someone who functioned as both an extension of Lucien's will and occasionally a skeptical check on it. She learned this because she overheard them. She had not meant to eavesdrop. She was in the kitchen refilling her coffee, her 3rd cup, because she'd been running on about 4 hours of fragmented sleep and her body had started presenting invoices. And Lucien and Cord were in the adjacent room and their voices carried in a way neither of them appeared to anticipate. She's a variable, Cord was saying. Every hour she's here is an hour Caldera's people are watching the building. I know. Move her tonight, safe house on the eastern. I said I know. A short silence. She's not going to stay put if you move her, Cord said, with the tone of someone who has had experience with people who don't stay put and has the resulting opinions about it. She's already pushing. She pushed this morning. She asked questions, Lucien said. That's not the same thing. The women you bring here don't usually ask questions. Another silence, different from the first. She didn't call my number, Lucien said. She called Juno's. Right. Which means she didn't come here looking for what I have. She came here because she was bleeding on a bathroom floor, and it was the only option that existed. His voice had stayed even throughout, but there was something underneath the evenness that Celine couldn't name from where she was standing. That is not the same thing as every other situation you're referencing. Cord was quiet for a moment. You're keeping her here. Not a question. I'm keeping her here, Lucien said. Celine stepped back from the kitchen doorway and looked at her coffee mug and considered what she'd just heard and what it meant and what it was reasonable to do with it. She filed it in the same place she'd been filing things all morning, the space in her head that was accumulating a picture of who Lucien Vale actually was, versus who it was convenient to assume he was. The picture was complicated. She was okay with complicated. Complicated she knew how to work with. She was in the main room when the alert came. She wouldn't have known it was an alert. The sound that came from the communications room was brief and technical and not loud enough to be alarming in the conventional sense. But the way every person in the room responded to it told her everything she needed to know about its significance. Cord was up from his chair before the sound finished. The man with the laptop stood. The 3rd man moved toward the hallway that led to the communications room. Even Juno, who had been reading with her feet tucked up on the couch, straightened. Lucien crossed the room in 4 strides and was in the communications room before Celine could process the sequence of movements. She followed. Nobody stopped her. Maybe nobody thought to, or maybe Lucien had anticipated she would and hadn't told anyone to prevent it. She stood in the doorway of the communications room and looked at the screens. The screens showed, from multiple angles, some clearly surveillance feeds, the street outside the building, and the building across the street, and the building beside that one. And on 3 of the feeds simultaneously, the same thing was visible. Men in vehicles, parked or moving slowly. 8, maybe 10, maybe more. Not police vehicles. Not anything official. They moved up the timeline, Cord said. Yes, Lucien said. How did they? Someone gave them a reason to. Lucien was looking at one specific feed, a feed showing a single figure on the sidewalk half a block from the building, standing with his hands in his pockets and his face tilted slightly up toward the building's facade. Even at the surveillance feed's resolution, through the pixelation and the angle, Celine recognized the way the person stood, the specific combination of the shoulders and the tilt of the head. She hadn't seen him clearly since he'd been slammed against the wall of her bathroom. He was apparently not where Lucien's people had put him. Dax Mercer was standing on the street outside the building, and he was not alone. And he was looking up at the windows 40 floors above him. And Celine understood with sudden and absolute clarity that whatever calculation Dax had been running, whatever trade he'd been trying to make, whatever survival math had been working in that hollow, desperate space behind his eyes, had led him here. He had brought them here, not passively, through information offered under pressure. He had physically walked to this building. He had stood on the sidewalk and made himself visible to every camera in range, and the men he'd brought with him had positioned themselves with the specific spacing of people who had been briefed on a layout. And while Celine was still processing the image on the screen, while the full horror of what Dax had just done, had chosen to do, had walked here to do, was still landing in her chest, the glass on the far side of the penthouse exploded inward. Not a crack. Not a fracture. The window destroyed itself all at once, a percussive implosion of glass and cold air, and the sharp immediate smell of cordite. And then there was a sound that she would spend a long time trying to find the right word for, and would eventually settle on the word wrong. A wrong sound, something that the human nervous system recognizes before the brain catches up with what it is. Gunfire. Celine was moving before she understood she was moving. Someone's hand on her arm, hauling her sideways into the hallway, and the hand was Lucien's, she could tell by the grip. And she hit the wall and he was in front of her with his back to her and his body between her and the main room, which was filling with smoke and the sounds of his men responding. She could hear Juno somewhere to her left saying something that wasn't quite words. She could hear glass still falling. She could feel Lucien's hand still on her arm, grip changing, not releasing, not tightening, just present, like a weight that had been placed there deliberately and had no intention of shifting. "Listen to me," he said. His voice was exactly the same as it had been at 2 a.m. on the phone. Cold and even and already somewhere past panic, operating at the frequency of someone who had decided long ago that terror was a tax paid by people who hadn't thought far enough ahead. There are corridors behind the kitchen. Second door on the right. Juno knows them. Where does it go? Out. He turned his head slightly and she could see his face from the side, jaw tight, eyes moving, tracking something she couldn't see from where she was. Go. And you? I'll meet you. He finally looked at her directly. Whatever was in his face in that moment wasn't something she had words for yet. It was too fast and too layered, and the building was too full of noise and smoke. Go! She grabbed Juno's hand and ran. Behind them, Blackwater's penthouse war began in earnest. And in the corridor hidden behind the kitchen, running through the dark with Juno's hand locked in hers, and the sounds of the fight receding behind the walls, Celine understood that she had crossed a line somewhere in the last 18 hours, and that the line did not go the other way, and that the woman who had packed a duffel bag and printed a bus ticket and planned to disappear quietly was a version of herself that had existed in a world that no longer applied. There was no Callaway port now. There was only this. The corridor smelled like concrete and old pipe insulation and something faintly chemical, the smell of a space that had been built for emergencies and had never quite lost the anxiety of its own purpose. Celine ran. Juno was half a step ahead of her, navigating by memory in near total darkness, one hand trailing the wall for orientation. The sounds from above, from the penthouse, from whatever was happening in those rooms they'd just left, were muffled now by floors of steel and concrete, but not gone. She could feel them more than hear them, a low, irregular percussion transmitted through the building's bones, vibrating up through the soles of her shoes every few seconds. She didn't let herself think about what was making the sounds. Left here, Juno said, and they turned, and a sliver of gray light appeared at the end of the corridor, a door with a thin seal of daylight around its frame, leading out to something that wasn't the building's main entrance. They hit the door together, and it opened into an alley. Cold air. Rain still falling, lighter now than last night, but persistent, the kind of rain that didn't commit to stopping. The alley ran between the back of Lucian's building and the service entrance of a parking structure, narrow enough that the walls were close on both sides, and the sky above was a thin strip of flat gray. A black car was already there, engine running, a man behind the wheel who looked up when they came through the door with the expression of someone who had been told to expect them and was relieved the timeline had held. Juno pulled the rear door open. "Get in." Celine got in. The car moved before the door was fully closed, pulling out of the alley with the specific controlled speed of someone who had been instructed not to draw attention and who understood exactly what drawing attention would cost. Celine turned and looked through the rear window at the building receding behind them. Lucien's building, the glass facade, 40 floors of it, and she counted windows automatically, the way you count things when you're trying to ground yourself in something measurable. She couldn't see the penthouse level from this angle. She didn't know what was happening up there. She faced forward. The driver's name was Theo, which she learned when Juno used it to ask him where they were going. He said the word meridian, and Juno nodded, and Celine filed the word away without knowing yet what it meant. The city moved past the windows in the flat gray light. Storefronts, intersections, the particular texture of Blackwater in early morning, a city that always looked like it was recovering from something. Juno's hands were in her lap and she was looking straight ahead, and her jaw was set in a way that Celine recognized from years of friendship as the expression Juno wore when she was managing a significant internal situation and had decided to manage it privately. "Are you okay?" Celine said. "No," Juno said simply. "But okay is not the current priority." They rode in silence for several minutes. "Theo," Celine said. The driver met her eyes in the rearview mirror. "The men who were outside the building, were they—" She stopped, reformed the question. "How many?" A brief pause. "Enough. That's not a number." It's not a number," she said again, not unkindly, just clearly. Another pause. 12, maybe 14 on the street, more in the vehicles. We don't have a full count yet." Celine looked at her hands. She'd been clenching them without noticing, and her knuckles were pale, and her injured wrist had been protesting the run through the corridor for several minutes, but she'd been successfully not registering it until now. She flexed the hand once, felt the complaint from the bruised joint, stopped. 12, maybe 14. And she'd been in that corridor. They'd both been in that corridor, while Lucien and his men absorbed the first wave of whatever Roman caldera had decided last night was worth building. She made herself breathe. The Meridian turned out to be a building on the city's northeast side, in a neighborhood that had the quality of a place that had been industrial once and had been converted into something else without entirely shaking the industrial memory. The building looked, from the outside, like a mid-scale commercial property, the kind of anonymous professional address that housed accounting firms and medical practices and businesses that didn't require foot traffic. Theo pulled into an underground parking level, and they took a service elevator to the 4th floor and walked down a hallway that was carpeted and climate-controlled and entirely unremarkable. And Juno used a key card on a door at the end, and they stepped into an apartment that was smaller than the penthouse but set up with the same purposeful efficiency. Locks on the windows, cameras visible in the corners, a kitchen stocked in the same specific way, a communications setup on a table near the far wall. A woman was sitting at the communications table, late 40s, close-cropped gray hair, glasses she didn't look up from when they entered. She said to no one in particular, "East team's engaged, West team's holding the lobby, Lucien's on the secure line." Juno crossed the room and picked up a handset from the table. Celine stood in the middle of the apartment and listened to half a conversation. "We're here," Juno said. Then, "Yes?" Then a longer silence during which her expression changed in ways Celine could read from across the room. Relief at something, then a tightening around the eyes that was the opposite of relief. "How many?" Another silence. "Okay?" And then quieter. "Okay. Yeah." She put the handset down. She turned and looked at Celine, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "He's fine," Juno said. "His people held the building. Caldera's men pulled back." She paused. "Two of Lucien's men are hurt. Not badly." Another pause. "Dax got away." Celine absorbed this information in the sequence it was offered. Lucien fine. Men hurt. Dax gone. "How did Dax get away?" she said. Juno's expression shifted into something more careful. "He was outside when it started. When Lucien's people came out, he was already gone. He brought them there and then ran. Looks like." Celine turned away and looked at the wall and breathed for a moment. She was doing a calculation she didn't want to do, but couldn't stop doing. The calculation of what it meant that Dax had not only given Caldera her location, but had physically walked to the building, had made himself visible on the street, had functioned as a coordinate and a signal, had used his body as a delivery mechanism for violence aimed at what? At Lucien? At her? At both, probably. In Dax's math, those things may have become the same. She thought about Juno sitting on the couch that morning, saying, in her careful, measured way, Dax is not just a bad boyfriend. She thought about the 8 months of photographs, the 2 years of careful, methodical isolation wearing the costume of love. She thought about the bus ticket, which was still somewhere in her apartment on Crail Street, in a bag that Dax had thrown against a wall. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, once, as if she could physically address whatever was happening in her chest. "Celine, I'm fine." "You don't have to be fine." "I know I don't have to be." She turned back around. "I'm choosing to be. There's a difference." She looked at the woman at the communications table, who was either not listening to them or performing not listening with considerable skill. "What happens next? What is Lucien doing now?" "He's going to make a move on Caldera's supply chain," Juno said. "Hit something financial that forces Caldera to pull resources back from the street. Buy time." "Buy time for what?" "For a meeting." Celine looked at her. "Lucien wants to negotiate a boundary, something that gets Caldera's operation out of Blackwater without—" Juno stopped, chose the words with visible effort. "Without the thing that ends with a lot of people dead. And Caldera will agree to that. Lucien thinks he'll agree to that if the alternative is presented clearly enough." "Presented how?" Juno was quiet for a moment. "That's what I don't know yet." 3 hours passed. Celine spent them in the apartment doing the things people do when they're waiting in unfamiliar spaces. She found a shower and used it, found clothes that someone had placed in the bedroom with the impersonal precision of a hotel turn-down service. Clothes that fit well enough that she understood they'd been selected based on information rather than guessing. She ate something from the kitchen that she barely tasted. She sat on the couch and looked at the wall and tried to organize the last 18 hours into a sequence that had internal logic, which was partly possible and partly not. The woman at the communications table, she learned the name was Rice, spoke occasionally in brief technical exchanges with people on the other end of various lines. Juno dozed on the couch beside Celine for about 40 minutes, with the sudden total surrender of someone whose body had overridden their intentions. Then woke with a sharp inhale and a look of brief disorientation before she assembled herself back into functioning order. It was just past noon when the door opened. Lucien came in first. Behind him, Cord. Behind Cord, 2 other men Celine recognized from the penthouse. Lucien had a cut above his left eye that had been closed with steri strips and not much else, and a jacket that had a tear across one shoulder that was not a fashion choice. He crossed the room without particular urgency and went directly to the communications table and spoke with Rice in a low voice for about 2 minutes, and then he straightened and turned and looked at the room. His eyes moved to Celine, checked something, moved on. "We have a window," he said, to the room generally. 6 hours, maybe 8. Caldera pulled his street teams back to regroup. His financial structure took a hit this morning. He glanced at Cord, who gave a single nod confirming something. "Which means he's managing internal problems right now. We use that." "The meeting," Juno said. "The meeting," Lucien confirmed. "Tonight. Caldera will come if I offer something worth coming for." "Will he come alone?" Cord said. "No, but he'll come." "What are you offering him?" Celine said. The room had one of its pauses. Lucian looked at her with the flat, steady attention she'd been on the receiving end of multiple times now, and was developing, against her better instincts, a complicated reaction to. Port access, he said. One route. Controlled, monitored, time-limited. Enough for him to tell his backers he got something from this without it being enough to actually establish the infrastructure he needs. You're going to offer him a deal you have no intention of honoring. I'm going to offer him a deal that satisfies his immediate need and gives federal investigators, who are currently 3 weeks behind on his operation, enough time to— You work with federal investigators. Occasionally, he said, with the inflection of someone for whom that word carried significant freight. When our interests overlap. She tried to process the full architecture of this. Lucian Vale, who controlled Blackwater's criminal underworld, who had built an empire from the rack-specific school of hard education, who had arrived at her bathroom door last night with armed men and no hesitation. This man also, occasionally, fed information to federal law enforcement when it served his purposes. That's a complicated position, she said. Yes, he said, without apology. Cord said, We need to move on the venue. Caldera's going to want— Midnight Crown, Lucian said. Cord went still. The other men in the room registered something. A shift in the air. A collective recalibration. Celine looked between them and then back at Lucian, who was looking at Cord with an expression that was waiting for an objection. That building hasn't been used in 4 years, Cord said carefully. Caldera knows it. He'll accept it as neutral ground. It's also isolated enough that if something goes wrong, there's no support infrastructure. I know what it is, Lucian said, and the quietness of his voice contained something that stopped Cord's sentence cleanly. Make the call. Cord looked at him for a moment longer than strictly necessary. Then he took out his phone and left the room. Things accelerated after that. The apartment transformed from a waiting space into a planning space. Maps on the table, Rice speaking into multiple lines simultaneously, men Celine hadn't met arriving through the parking level and being briefed in the kitchen. Lucian moved through all of it with the compressed, efficient energy she'd been watching all morning, allocating attention and decisions at a rate that made her think again about what Juno had said. His brain doesn't let him stop. She found herself sitting at the edge of the main table watching the planning unfold and not being told to leave, which she interpreted as either oversight or permission and decided to treat as permission. She was watching a street map being marked up when she noticed Dax's name. It was on a document near her elbow, a printed sheet that had come from somewhere in the last hour, and most of it was in language too technical or coded for her to parse quickly, but Dax Mercer's name was on it, next to a location. She turned the sheet slightly. The location was the Midnight Crown Casino. She looked at the document for a long moment. Then she looked at Lucien, who was on the other side of the table deep in a conversation with 2 of his men about entry points. She looked at the document again. Dax was going to be at the casino tonight. Not as a random coincidence. His name was on a document that was part of the planning for tonight's meeting, which meant Lucian knew Dax was going to be there, which meant Lucian had not mentioned this to her. She waited until the conversation on the other side of the table paused. Dax is going to be at the casino tonight, she said. Lucien looked at her. The other 2 men looked at her, then at Lucien. Yes, Lucien said. You didn't mention that. I was going to. When? A small pause. When it was operationally relevant. It's relevant to me now, she said. It was relevant to me when you were telling me the plan. Celine, don't. She heard herself use the same word she'd used this morning and felt the symmetry of it. The way this particular response kept being necessary. Why is Dax going to be there? He ran. He's been working for Caldera. She stopped. She was assembling something. The pieces were in front of her and she was putting them together, and she was not going to like the picture they made. You know where he is? Lucian's expression didn't change. You've known where he is since this morning, she said. Since before this morning. You said he got away when your people came out of the building. But your people were already outside when it started. She kept her voice level through an act of will that cost her something. You let him go. Silence. Why did you let him go? She said. One of the men across the table found a reason to be somewhere else. The other one studied the map with sudden, intense focus. Because he's useful at the casino tonight, Lucian said. No evasion, no redirect. Just the fact, clean and cold. Caldera trusts him enough to bring him. Dax inside that room changes what I can control. You're using him. Yes. He brought 12 armed men to your building this morning. 2 of your people got hurt, and you're using a resource, Lucian said. That's what this is. Dax Mercer is a frightened man with one remaining bargaining chip, which is access to Caldera's trust. I am using that chip. He held her eyes. It is not personal. It's personal to me, she said. I know. And something in the way he said it was different from the even metered delivery she'd been getting all day. Not softer exactly, but with a quality of acknowledgement in it that cost him something to produce. I know it is, and I'm telling you anyway, because you asked me to tell you things. She sat with that. She looked at the document with Dax's name on it. She thought about what it meant that Lucian had let him go this morning. Had looked at a man who'd brought violence to his building and had calculated that violence's usefulness and made a cold decision. She thought about whether she was angry at that decision. She was, partially. She was also, in a part of herself she found unpleasant to examine, not entirely surprised. What's Dax's role tonight, she said. He confirms the meeting is genuine. Caldera doesn't trust my word alone. There's too much history. Dax is the one who goes to Caldera and says Lucian Vale wants to negotiate. This is real. I was there when it started. Here's what he's offering. A human reference, she said. Essentially. And after. Lucian looked at her. After the meeting, she said. After Caldera has what he needs from Dax. What happens to Dax? A pause that told her more than the words that followed it. That depends on Dax, Lucian Simes said. She stood up from the table. She needed to be standing for what she was about to say, and she needed the extra 2 seconds the standing gave her to say it without her voice doing something she didn't want it to do. I want to be there tonight, she said. The room, which had been maintaining a careful ambient noise level, went quiet. No, Lucian said. He was going to... She stopped. Started again. 2 years. He spent 2 years building something that was designed to end with me handed over to men who traffic people. I want to look him in the face in that room. That is not a reason I can work with tactically. I'm not offering you a tactical reason, she said. I'm telling you what I need. Lucian stood on the other side of the table and looked at her with that flat, still, measuring attention, and she could see him working through something. Not the tactical problem, which he'd already assessed, but the other problem. The one that didn't have a clean operational answer. Celine, he said, and this time the way he said her name was different from either of the previous ways. Not a management attempt. Something more direct than that. If you're in that building tonight, you become a target. Not leverage. A target. Caldera will see you there and he will understand something about why you matter, and that will change what I can do in that room. Or, she said, he will see me there and he will understand that I am not afraid of him, and that will change something else. A long silence. That, Lucian said, is either very brave or very stupid. I know, she said. I've been both before. I'll figure out which one this is afterward. Something moved in his face. She didn't have a word for it yet. She was adding it to the list of things she was still building vocabulary for. He looked at Cord, who had reappeared in the doorway at some point during this exchange, and was watching the conversation with the expression of a man who had placed a bet on a specific outcome and was recalculating his odds. She comes, Lucian said. Back position. Corridor access the whole time. Cord said nothing. Cord? Your call, Cord said with the tone of a man who is registering disagreement through perfect compliance. The afternoon bled into evening, and evening into the specific quality of Blackwater's night. The neon bleeding onto wet streets, the city's second life starting in the spaces between its official surfaces. At some point, Celine ate something again. At some point, she sat with Juno in the bedroom, and they didn't talk very much, and that was okay. That was the specific luxury of a friendship old enough to not require constant sound. You don't have to go tonight, Juno said at one point. I know. He'll keep you safe here. I know he will, Celine said. That's not why I'm going. Juno looked at her with the eyes of someone who has been watching a friend make decisions for a long time and has learned the difference between decisions she can argue with and decisions that are already finished. Okay, Juno said. You're not coming. I wasn't planning to. Good. They left for the Midnight Crown at 11:45. The casino sat on the western edge of Blackwater's old waterfront district, in a block that the city's development had lapped twice and left behind, surrounded by buildings that were either abandoned or in the specific developmental purgatory of properties whose ownership was too complicated to resolve quickly. It had been closed for 4 years. Before that, it had been running for 30, under various names and various fronts, always serving as the waterfront's most visible monument to the specific way Blackwater's money moved. From the outside, it still had its bones. The facade, the old sign with most of the letters present, the broad entrance steps leading up to doors that were chained but not well. Rain had been working at the building for years, and the work showed. Cracked stone. A window on the second level that had been covered in plastic sheeting that was now more holes than plastic. Lucian's car stopped half a block away, and they walked the rest. He walked beside her. Not in front, the way he'd walked in her apartment last night. Beside, which she registered as a deliberate adjustment. He didn't touch her. The cut above his eye, cleaned and closed, looked worse in the streetlight than it had in the apartment. He was wearing something dark again. No overcoat tonight, and the cold was genuine, and she watched him not react to it because apparently that was a thing he did. "What you're going to see in that room," he said as they approached the entrance. "Some of it will be difficult." "I've had a difficult 24 hours, she said. "My tolerance is calibrated. There are things about Caldera's operation I haven't told you yet." She looked at him. "Tell me now." He stopped walking. They were 10 feet from the casino entrance, in the shadow of the old sign with its missing letters, and his men were fanning out around the building in a pattern she could hear but not quite see, the sound of careful movement in the dark. "Dax," he said, "was not the first person to identify you for Caldera's network." She stood very still. "There was someone before him," Lucian said. "Someone who knew you before you met Dax. Someone who introduced you to him, in fact." He held her eyes, and his expression had the quality of a man delivering information he did not want to deliver but will not withhold. "Someone who told Caldera that you were ideal. Isolated enough, self-sufficient enough, unlikely to be looked for." The cold in her stomach was back. Deeper than last night. Different in quality. Last night's cold had been the cold of danger, immediate and external. This was the cold of something happening inside the architecture of things she'd believed were solid. "Who?" she said. Lucian's jaw moved once. "There's someone in that building tonight who will be expecting you not to know," he said. "I need you to understand that before you walk through the door." "Tell me who." The casino doors opened from the inside. Light spilled out across the wet stone steps. Not much light. The old chandeliers running on whatever backup power the building still held. Flickering and dim and gold-tinted. Several figures appeared in the doorway. Roman Caldera's men, positioned with the practiced spacing of a reception that was also a checkpoint, and behind them, stepping into the light, a figure that Celine's eyes found before her brain fully processed the finding, a figure she knew the posture of, the silhouette of, the way of standing with shoulders slightly angled, the specific way of holding the head that she'd been familiar with for years. Standing beside Roman Caldera, looking directly at her, was Juno. Not the Juno who had said okay and stayed behind in the apartment. Not the Juno who had navigated the dark corridor with her hand trailing the wall. Not the Juno who had said "I'm sorry" on the couch this morning with careful, weighted words. This Juno was standing in Roman Caldera's light, with her hands loose at her sides and her face arranged in an expression Celine had never seen on it before. Not the careful Juno, not the loving Juno, but a version of Juno that had been assembled for a purpose and was only now being shown. The entire history of 2 years rearranged itself in Celine's chest in about 3 seconds. The introductions. The easy way Juno had brought Dax into the picture. The photography studio on the north side that she'd never once been invited to visit. The 2 years of careful friendship that had, she now understood, been the architecture of something that was not friendship at all, but a scaffolding erected around a specific intended outcome. The thing Celine felt was not anger. It was so far past anger that anger was not even visible from where she was standing. She turned to Lucien. He was already looking at her. "You knew," she said. Her voice was flat and quiet, and entirely unlike any version of her voice she'd heard in the last 24 hours. "You knew it was Juno." I found out 2 hours ago, he said, and I want you to understand that the man standing beside Caldera right now is dealing with the same information I am. He paused. That is my sister. The word landed. Celine looked at Juno, who was still watching her from across the wet stone steps with that assembled, purposeful expression. Looked at Lucien, whose face was the most controlled she'd seen it, and whose hands at his sides were not entirely still, and she understood in the full terrible weight of it that she had walked into a casino where the person who had built 2 years of her life into a trap was standing, and that the man beside her was facing something that made her own betrayal look simple, and there was nowhere left to go but forward. She put one foot on the first step. She climbed the first step, then the second, then the third, and by the time her foot found the fourth, her legs had made the decision her brain was still arguing about, and the argument became irrelevant. Lucien moved with her, not ahead, not behind, beside, matching her pace exactly, and she was aware of him the way you're aware of something large and dangerous moving in parallel, not threatening, but present in a way that changed the quality of the air between them. She could hear his breathing, controlled, deeper than normal, which was the only indication that what he was walking toward was costing him anything at all. Behind them, his men followed at the spacing of a formation that had been briefed. The casino swallowed them whole. The interior of the Midnight Crown was what 4 years of abandonment did to a place that had once been built to impress. The chandeliers still hung, but half their bulbs were dead, and the remaining ones flickered on the backup power with an irregular rhythm that made the whole space pulse, light and shadow, trading places every few seconds. Water had come in through the damaged second-floor window and left long brown streaks down one wall. The carpet, once deep red, had gone to the color of dried blood in most places, and to black mold in others near the walls. Slot machines stood in rows like soldiers who'd been standing at attention so long they'd started to lean. The bar along the east wall still had bottles on its shelves, though most of them were empty or broken, and the mirror behind it had developed a crack that ran corner to corner and made every reflection look like it was happening in 2 separate worlds simultaneously. The smell was damp wood and rust and something sweet underneath that Celine couldn't identify and didn't want to. Roman Caldera was waiting in the middle of the casino floor. He was shorter than she'd built him in her head. She'd been constructing him for 24 hours from descriptions and implications and the cold data on Lucien's table, and she'd assembled something tall and cinematic, which was her mistake. The most dangerous men she'd encountered in her life had almost universally been unremarkable to look at. Caldera was compact, with the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm but from practice. The deliberate absence of unnecessary movement that people learned in environments where unnecessary movement attracted consequences. Late 40s. A face that had been lived in hard. Dark suit that had been expensive once and was being maintained past the point where maintenance was winning. He had 6 men with him that she could see. Maybe more she couldn't. And beside him, Juno. Celine looked at her directly and held it. Juno held it back. The expression on her face was not the assembled purposeful expression from the doorway. That had been a performance for distance, Celine understood now, something constructed for the moment of revelation. Up close, Juno's face was doing something more complicated. There was no triumph in it, no coldness. What Celine could read, in the specific granular way of someone who had 2 years of practice reading this face, was something closer to the expression of a person standing at the bottom of a hole they had dug themselves and are only now measuring the depth of. It did not make Celine feel better. It made her feel, if anything, more precise. Lucien stopped about 15 feet from Caldera. Celine stopped with him. She made herself keep her eyes forward and not track to Juno again, because tracking to Juno was giving away something she wanted to control the release of. Caldera looked at Lucien with the expression of one professional evaluating another. Not friendly, not hostile, the face of a transaction in progress. "Veil," he said. "Caldera," Lucien said. "Interesting choice of location." "You know it, I know it. Neither of us has the home advantage." Caldera's eyes moved to Celine. They moved over her with the specific quality of assessment that she'd been on the receiving end of from men like this before. Not sexual exactly, but evaluative in a way that was worse, treating her as a quantity rather than a person. She met his eyes and held them with her chin level and her face still, and her heart running at approximately twice its normal speed behind her sternum. "She's here," Caldera said, not to her but to Lucien. "She's here," Lucien confirmed.
That tells me something. It should, Lucien said. She's the reason we're having this conversation instead of the other kind. Something moved in Caldera's expression. Explain that.
You've been trying to find a pressure point for 14 months, Lucien said. You found one. It worked differently than you planned. She called my number by accident, which means you're operating on information that had a random element you didn't account for, which means your intelligence on my network has gaps. He paused, letting that land. I'm offering you something that fills those gaps without costing either of us more than the last 24 hours already has. Caldera was quiet for a moment. You broke 3 of my men's hands this morning. 4, Lucien said, and a collarbone. Your count is off. A very brief pause in which something happened behind Caldera's eyes that might have been reassessment. I'm listening, Caldera said. Port access, Lucien said. Route 7, which you already know about because you've been trying to buy access to it for 8 months. 60-day window, verifiable, with a fee structure that accounts for the infrastructure costs and gives you enough margin to satisfy whoever is waiting on your end for results. He let a beat go. In exchange, you pull your operation out of Blackwater completely, not reduced, gone. Every network, every associate, every arrangement that touches this city. You get Route 7 for 60 days, and then you're done here. Caldera looked at him for a long moment. The chandeliers pulsed above them, light and dark, light and dark. And the girl, Caldera said. Is not part of the negotiation, Lucien said, with a flatness that closed the sentence like a door. She is part of the negotiation, Caldera said, pleasantly, because I've already spent resources on her, and those resources— Name a number, Lucien said. Caldera blinked. The pleasantness shifted slightly, recalibrated. Excuse me. Name the number that makes the resource expenditure whole, and I'll pay it. Tonight. That closes the account. She's not leverage. She's not cargo. She is a woman who got caught in the edge of something that was never about her, and I'm offering you a buyout on whatever you think she's worth. Lucien's voice was entirely even throughout this, the same metered delivery he'd been using for 24 hours. But underneath the evenness there was something new, a compression, a density, the quality of someone who has done the calculation and is willing to pay whatever the number is and does not want to examine too closely why. Name it. Caldera looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was not a good smile. It had the quality of a person who has just seen something they'd been waiting to see. Confirmation of a hypothesis, the specific satisfaction of being right about something you'd suspected. There it is, Caldera said softly. Lucien said nothing. She's not a favor to your sister, Caldera said. She's not a courtesy. You— He tilted his head, still smiling, examining Lucien with the attention of someone studying something interesting. 24 hours. That's all it took. The offer stands, Lucien said. The personal commentary doesn't affect it. No, Caldera agreed. It doesn't. He looked at Celine again, differently this time, the recalculation visible in his eyes. But it does affect the number. Celine felt the shift in the room before she fully understood it. Caldera's men had been still since they'd entered, positioned with the professional spacing of a reception that was also a threat assessment, and that stillness had a quality that she'd been tracking with the back of her nervous system without actively registering. Now the quality changed. Not movement, just the absence of the particular kind of stillness that meant waiting. They'd moved into a different mode. She didn't have a word for it. Her body had one. Then she heard Dax. His voice came from somewhere to the left, from the direction of the bar and its cracked mirror, which she hadn't looked at long enough because she'd been focused on Caldera and on Juno and on the shape of the conversation in front of her. Dax was there, at the edge of the bar, and he was talking to one of Caldera's men in a low, urgent voice, and there was something in the urgency that didn't fit the situation as she understood it. He was supposed to be Caldera's confirmation. His role here was supposed to be simple, but Dax Mercer had never in his life played a simple role when a complicated one was available. He's wired, Dax said, and his voice came out too loud for the register he'd been aiming for, cracking across the space of the casino floor like something breaking. Lucien's wired. I saw them set it up. There are people outside. Lucien moved, not toward Caldera. Sideways and forward in a single motion that carried him past 2 of Caldera's men before they could close the gap, and his hand was on Dax's collar and Dax hit the bar with a sound that sent the remaining bottles rattling on their shelves. And the cracked mirror behind the bar showed Celine a fractured version of the scene. Lucien's back, Dax's face, the doubled image in the broken glass. "That's not," Dax started.
"Shut up," Lucien
said. One hand, collar, not yelling. The quietness of it was the worst part. Then everything happened at once. Caldera said one word to his men, something short in a language Celine didn't speak, and the men who had been still stopped being still. Not all of them moving the same direction. 2 toward Lucien and Dax at the bar, 2 spreading outward toward the room's perimeter, and 1 moving toward Celine specifically, directly, with the economical precision of someone who had been assigned an objective and was executing it. She moved before she decided to. Left, hard, behind the nearest row of slot machines, the carpet grabbing at her feet in the damp, the machines clanking against each other as she clipped the corner of one with her shoulder. The man behind her was close enough that she heard him breathing, a heavier sound than his size suggested, like the effort was costing him. She got around the end of the row and stopped, pressing flat against the side of the last machine, and she heard him come around the corner a second later, and she didn't think about it. She took the 2 steps and hit him from the side with everything she had, which was not enough, not even close to enough. He was twice her weight, and his reaction was fast, and she knew the moment her shoulder connected with his ribs that this was not going to go the way she'd wanted it to go. His arm caught her across the upper back, and she went down on the carpet hard, knees and palms, and the carpet was wet and smelled of mildew, and the impact sang up through her injured wrist in a long, bright note of pain that she folded around and pushed through because there was no alternative. She got up. That was the thing she found out about herself in that moment. She got up, even with the wrist screaming and her palms burning from the carpet. She got up because the man was already reaching for her, and staying down was not a survivable option. She hit him with her elbow, the point of it, angled up toward his face the way someone had shown her once in a self-defense class she'd taken after month 7 with Dax and had never entirely forgotten. It connected somewhere near his jaw. He stopped for 1 second. 1 second was Cord's arrival. She heard him rather than saw him, the specific sound of someone who moves through conflict with professional fluency, efficient and almost quiet, and then the man who had been reaching for her was no longer a problem in her immediate vicinity, and Cord's hand was on her shoulder, not grabbing, just placing, and he said, "This way," with the inflection of someone stating a cardinal direction. They moved. The casino was not what it had been 30 seconds ago. The space had reorganized itself into a series of smaller, violent situations occurring simultaneously. She could hear it more than see it, the sounds of close-quarters conflict in a building where every surface echoed differently, the slot machines amplifying impacts and deadening voices in alternating patches. One of the chandeliers had been hit by something and was swinging, which sent the light moving across the floor in a slow arc that made everything look like it was underwater. She saw Lucien. He was near the bar, and he had one of Caldera's men on the floor and was not looking at the man on the floor, but across the casino toward where Caldera had been standing. And Caldera was no longer standing there, which was the problem Lucien's face was processing. His cut above the eye had reopened. She could see the dark line of it tracking down toward his cheekbone, and his jacket was torn in a new place, and he was breathing hard, hard enough that she could see it from 20 feet away, the rise and fall of his chest with the specific urgency of someone who has been burning through their physical reserves and is aware of the account balance. Their eyes met. He said one word from across the room, just her name. Not a command, something closer to a question or a check, the word doing the work of, "Are you standing? Are you whole? Tell me you're still in this." "I'm fine," she called back because it was close enough to true. He nodded once and turned and went after Caldera. She followed, not because she was supposed to, because Caldera was moving toward the back of the casino, toward a corridor she could see behind the demolished stage area in the far corner, and in that corridor, visible for just a moment before the swinging chandelier sent the light the other way, she saw Juno. Juno, being moved by 2 of Caldera's remaining men. Not dragged. She was walking, but not walking freely, the specific constrained movement of someone being directed. Her head was down and she was moving fast, and she was not looking behind her. Celine ran. The stage area was elevated, 3 steps up from the casino floor, and littered with the remains of sound equipment that had been left to corrode for 4 years, coils of cable that had fused to the floor in damp tangles, microphone stands rusted into angles. She picked through it without slowing enough and caught her foot in a cable and went to one knee and came back up and made it to the corridor entrance in time to see the door at its far end swinging closed. The corridor was narrow and dark and smelled worse than the casino floor. Service corridor, probably. Concrete walls, exposed pipe overhead, a single bulb at one end that had survived whatever had killed the others. She ran its length and hit the door at the end, and it opened into the loading area behind the building. Night air. Cold and wet. The rain had committed again, heavier now, the kind that blurred the boundaries between surfaces. The loading area was a wide concrete pad connected to the alley behind the casino, and it was not empty. Caldera was there. He had Juno. Not the 2 men, just Caldera, which told her the 2 men were somewhere behind her, which told her this had been a funnel. She'd been meant to come through that corridor. She filed this information and shelved the implications because the only immediately relevant fact was Juno, standing with Caldera's hand at her arm and Caldera's body angled between her and the alley exit. Juno's face, in the loading area's single exterior light, was a different thing than it had been on the casino steps. The assembled expression was gone. What was there instead was something stripped. Not fear exactly, but the expression of a person who has run out of the performance they were sustaining, and what's underneath it is just a person, messy and scared and sorry. A person who made a series of choices and is standing in the full weight of them. "Stop there," Caldera said. Celine stopped. "Where's Vale?" he said. "Inside." "He's going to come out that door in about 30 seconds, Caldera said, which means we have 30 seconds to complete a transaction. He looked at her with that evaluative attention, the quantity assessment. You walk away. Right now, out the alley, you're done. I don't follow. His sister... He tightened his grip on Juno's arm marginally. I take as compensation for the morning's expenses. Juno made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. The kind made by someone who is trying to control their breathing and is losing. She's not yours, Celine said. She was, Caldera said, simply. For 3 years she has been a reliable source of exactly the kind of intelligence I need about Vale's operation. What he's planning, what his vulnerabilities are, who he trusts. He paused. Who he might trust. The way he said the last sentence made Celine very still. She found you for me, Caldera said. Specifically. That's not something I let go of lightly. He tilted his head. She's also the reason tonight's timeline moved up. She told me this morning that you were in the building, that Vale was keeping you there, that his behavior was already different from his standard operating mode. He looked at Celine with something that was almost informational, almost like he was doing her a service. She called me 4 hours before you and Vale walked down to that table to plan. Juno had closed her eyes. Celine looked at her. At the closed eyes, at the line of her jaw, at the way her shoulders had curved inward, like someone bracing for the specific impact of being seen clearly. 2 years of friendship moving through Celine's mind with the velocity of a full accounting. Every conversation, every careful word, every, I was scared for you, and I'm sorry, and you're the first person I've brought here. She felt the full scope of it. She let herself feel it for exactly as long as it took to feel it, which was about 3 seconds. Then she put it somewhere it could not touch her right now. Juno, she said. Juno's eyes opened. Did you call him this morning? A long pause. Caldera was watching this exchange with the quality of someone attending a demonstration. Yes, Juno said. Her voice was very small and very clear. Before the window, before Lucien went to the table. Yes, while we were sitting on the couch. Juno's face did something complicated. You were sleeping. You'd finally stopped. I wasn't sleeping, Celine said. Juno's face fell apart. Not dramatically, it just fell apart, the way faces do when the last available defense is gone, a quiet disassembly of every constructed thing. Her eyes filled with water that wasn't rain. I didn't want anyone to get hurt, Juno said. It started as information. That was all it was supposed to be. Caldera wanted to know when Lucien was vulnerable, when he was distracted,
What could get through his... Through his what? Celine said. Her voice was level and very cold. Through his guard. Juno swallowed. He doesn't trust people. He never has. Caldera knew if something made him react personally, it would create an opening, and I was supposed to just find
someone he'd react to, Celine said. I was supposed to find a situation, Juno said. A thing. I was looking for 6 months and then I found you, and you were exactly... Her voice broke. I didn't plan what happened after. I didn't plan to actually become my friend. Juno didn't answer, which was its own answer. The door behind Celine opened. Lucien came through it with 2 of his men, and he stopped when he saw the loading area, and he assessed everything in about 2 seconds. Caldera, Juno, Celine standing between them, the geometry of the situation, and his face did the specific thing it had been doing all night. The compression of emotion into pure function, and then he looked at his sister. He looked at his sister for a long moment. It was the most devastating look Celine had ever seen on a human face, and the most devastating part of it was that it wasn't angry. It was something that had moved past anger into a territory that didn't have a clean name. Not forgiveness, not devastation, not the cold professional assessment he used on threats. Something that was all of those things, and none of them. The specific expression of a person who is standing at the end of something they have been trying not to see coming. Juno, he said. She said, I'm sorry. 2 words. The complete version of them, not as a deflection, but as the full weight of what they meant. He didn't move. Caldera shifted his grip on Juno's arm and said, Vale, the offer I made her still stands. I walk out of here with what I came with. You let me go. Tomorrow we talk about Route 7 without... No, Lucien said. You're not in a position... I'm in exactly the position I've been in all night, Lucien said. You have something of mine. I'm going to take it back. The only question is what condition we're all in afterward. He looked at Caldera with those still dark eyes, and the scar on his jaw was very visible in the loading area's light, and the reopened cut above his eye was still tracking dark toward his cheekbone, and he looked like what he was, a man who had been built by terrible things and had not been unmade by them. Let her go. And if I don't? A pause, short as a held breath. You know the answer to that, Lucien said. You've been trying to find a way through my operation for 14 months. You know who I am. You know what I'm willing to do when something matters to me. Do I? Caldera said, and the way he said it was interesting. Not challenging, but genuinely curious. The question of a man who has been collecting information and is comparing it to new data. Because what I know about Lucien Vale is that he does not allow anything to matter to him. He built his entire operation on the principle that nothing personal exists. No attachment, no loyalty beyond utility, no... He glanced at Celine, brief, pointed. No one who could be used. Silence. That was before last night, Lucien said. The loading area went very still. Caldera looked at Celine, Betrayal, looked at Lucien. And for a moment, Celine watched him calculate. Not the tactical calculation, not the operational one, but the fundamental assessment of whether the person in front of him had just said what he appeared to have said, and whether that was real. It was real. She could feel it from where she was standing, the way you feel heat from a fire you're not looking at directly. It was real in the way he'd said it, in the flatness of it, in the specific quality of a man who does not say things like that and was saying it anyway. Her chest did something she didn't have immediate language for. Caldera released Juno's arm, not all at once. The decision moved through him in a visible wave, a recalculation of the entire evening's mathematics, and then his grip opened and Juno stepped away from him, and Caldera took 1 step back. You'll regret making this personal, Caldera said. I already do, Lucien said. It doesn't change it. Caldera looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at his men. The ones inside, she could hear them through the door, the sounds of the inside situation having reached some kind of resolution. And he made a decision visible in his posture, a soldier's decision, the decision of a man who knows when a field has been lost and is choosing to preserve what he can for the next engagement. This isn't over, Caldera said. No, Lucien agreed. It isn't. Caldera moved toward the alley. His men fell in around him from positions she hadn't seen them take, peeling out of shadows, and they moved with the collective purpose of a group executing a withdrawal. No running, controlled. She watched them reach the alley mouth, and she watched the darkness take them, and she listened to the sounds of their vehicles starting somewhere down the block. She waited until the engine sounds were gone. Then she turned. Juno was standing 6 feet away, arms wrapped around herself, rain flattening her hair against her face. Lucienne was 8 feet behind her, and the space between them was the most complicated 8 feet of air Celine had ever stood near. Brother and sister, looking at each other across 2 years of a truth that had been moving underground toward this specific surface for a long time. Juno said, "Lucienne." Just the name, a complete sentence. He walked to her. He walked to her and put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder. And Celine watched something that was simultaneously the most private thing she'd seen in her life, and the most important. The specific, terrible, complicated love of two people who have survived something by holding on to each other through things that would have broken most families, and who are now standing at the edge of a thing that might break them anyway, and are choosing not to let it. He held her for a moment. One moment. His face above her head was still controlled, still functional, but in the loading area's thin light, she could see the thing it was costing him. Then he stepped back. "We're going to talk," he said. "Later, when this is finished." Juno nodded. She was crying in the quiet way of someone who's decided not to perform it. The tears just present, just real, just happening alongside everything else. Lucien turned to his men. "Put her in the car. Stay with her." He looked at Cord, who had appeared from the corridor behind them at some point. "Is the inside clear?" "Clear," Cord said. His voice had the quality of someone who had seen everything that had happened in the last few minutes and was processing it privately. "Caldera's men are gone. 2 detained, 3 left with the others." "Dax," Lucian said. A pause. "Inside," Cord said. "He's not doing well. He's been trying to talk to anyone who'll listen." Lucian looked at Celine. She met his eyes. "I want to talk to him," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The rain continued. His cut was still bleeding, tracking slow and dark down toward his jaw, and she thought about reaching up and pressing her hand against it, and then thought about what that was a thought that came from and put it aside for later. "He doesn't deserve," Lucian started. "I know he doesn't," she said. "I'm not doing it for him." A pause. "Then for what?" "To close it," she said. "Just to close it. Look him in the face and close it." She held Lucien's eyes and didn't look away. "I need to do that." He looked at her for a long moment, in the rain and the thin light of the loading area, with everything the night had been written on both their faces, and she watched him make a decision that he was not making for operational reasons. "Okay," he said. They walked back into the Midnight Crown Casino together. Inside, the chandeliers had stopped swinging. The light was steady now, dim and gold and flickering, and the casino floor was quiet except for Cord's men moving through it, doing the specific, efficient work of aftermath. Celine walked through the rows of slot machines. One of them had been hit hard enough to shatter its face, cards and coin tray, and glass scattered across the ruined carpet, and around the edge of the bar with its cracked mirror. Dax was on the floor behind the bar, not badly hurt. She assessed this quickly and clinically, the way she'd been assessing things all night. Cut on his forehead, something wrong with the way he was holding his left side, the specific compressed breathing of bruised ribs. He was sitting with his back against the cabinet below the bar and his wrists zip-tied in front of him, and his face was the face of a man who had run out of calculations. He looked up when she appeared. He opened his mouth. "Don't," she said. She was not yelling. She had enough control for that, barely. "Don't explain. Don't apologize. Don't—" She stopped because there was a version of this conversation that lasted an hour and did not give her anything she didn't already have, and she had not come here for the long version. She crouched down so she was at his eye level. "I need you to understand something," she said. Her voice was very quiet and very clear. "Not for your benefit. You don't get the benefit of understanding from me. This is for mine." She held his eyes, which were wet, which she noted and filed away without giving it any weight. "I was not a mistake you made. I was not a victim of your circumstances. You looked at me and you made a choice, and you made it again,
and every time you made it while you were telling me something else." She paused. "That's done. You're done. Whatever comes next for you has nothing to do with me, and I'm choosing that right now, in front of you, so you know I chose it. Not ran from it, chose it."
Dax said nothing. She stood up. She turned and walked away from him. Lucian was standing near the entrance to the service corridor, watching her walk toward him across the casino floor. His face was not managed for once. The controlled professional surface had thinned, and what was underneath it was something she was still calibrating, but which felt, in the flickering light of the Midnight Crown Casino, like the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet, but recognized by the way it made the air change when she came near it. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her wrist, which was throbbing again from the fall on the carpet and the elbow strike and everything else the last few hours had asked of it. He looked at her face. He looked at her with all of that compressed, precise attention, and for once it was not calculating anything of Buzz. It was just present, just there, just him looking at her. "You all right?" he said. It was the simplest thing he'd said to her since 2 a.m. the previous night. She considered the question seriously. "I'm going to be," she said. Above them, one of the chandeliers finally lost the last of its remaining bulbs, and the section of casino behind them went dark, and somewhere in the building's walls the backup power stuttered, and the remaining lights went amber, and the Midnight Crown Casino looked for a moment exactly like what it was, a palace that had held 1,000 bad decisions and was finally, tonight, letting the last of them go up in the amber light. Celine looked at the man in front of her. He had a cut above his eye and a scar on his jaw and hands that had done things she was still learning the full inventory of. And he had come to a bathroom door at 2 a.m., and he had kept her name like a thing that mattered from the very first moment he'd heard it. And she was not naive enough to think that meant what it meant in simple stories. But she was also standing here alive and unbroken in a city that had been trying to resolve her into a statistic, and the man in front of her was the reason the resolution had not held. She reached up and pressed her palm flat against the cut above his eye. He went very still. She kept her hand there for a moment, the warmth of it, the contact. "We need to get out of here," she said. "And then we need to figure out everything after," he said quietly. "Everything after," she agreed. The casino door opened and Cord said something from the threshold about vehicles, and she heard the distant sound of sirens somewhere north of the waterfront. And the city was already absorbing what had happened here, the way Blackwater always absorbed things. Without ceremony, without acknowledgement, the way a large, dark body of water closes over a stone. But the stone had been thrown, and in the casino, and in the alley, and in the loading area behind it, the last night of Roman Caldera's Blackwater operation was ending. What came next, neither of them could yet see clearly, but they walked toward it together. The sirens came from the north and then from the east and then from everywhere. The way emergency sound moves through a city that has finally decided to pay attention to something it had been successfully ignoring. Celine heard them from the back seat of Lucien's car as they pulled away from the Midnight Crown's block, and she turned and watched the casino's facade recede through the rear window. The old sign, the missing letters, the building sitting in the rain with the specific dignity of a thing that has witnessed everything and is now simply waiting to be dealt with. The amber lights inside had gone out completely somewhere between the corridor and the car. The building was dark when she lost sight of it. She faced forward. Her palm was still warm from where she'd pressed it against Lucien's cut. She was aware of this in the specific, involuntary way of something the body catalogs without asking permission. She put her hands in her lap and looked at the city moving past the windows and breathed. Lucien was on the phone. Low voice, the language clipped and precise, giving instructions to people she couldn't see doing things she couldn't fully track. He would be doing this for hours, probably. The operational aftermath of a night like this didn't end when the building emptied out. It ramified. It spread through networks and accounts, and arrangements that needed recalibrating and people who needed to understand what had changed and what hadn't. She let him work. Cord drove. He hadn't said anything since the loading area, which she was coming to understand was Cord's way of processing things he had opinions about. The opinion existed, the expression of it waited. They went to the Meridian building, not the penthouse. The penthouse needed, as Cord eventually said in his economic way, work. She understood this to mean the window and whatever had come through it, and the rooms those events had touched. Forensic work, probably, or just the very practical work of a space that had been damaged and needed to be made functional again.
The Meridian apartment was quiet when they arrived. Juno was already there. She'd been brought ahead, and she was sitting on the couch in the same position Celine had last seen her in what felt like a different chapter of a very long night. She wasn't crying anymore. She was just sitting, which was somehow worse.
Lucien came in behind Celine and stopped when he saw Juno, and the room arranged itself around the two of them with the specific gravity of a situation that everyone in it understood needed space. Celine went to the kitchen. She found water and she drank half a glass standing at the sink looking at the wall, and then she filled it again and stood there with it and listened to the silence from the other room, which was a specific kind of silence. Not empty, not comfortable, but the silence of two people who are deciding jointly and separately where to begin. She heard Lucien's voice finally. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't try. She drank the rest of the water. She found a chair near the kitchen's narrow window that looked out over the street below, and she sat in it, and she felt the full inventory of the last 26 hours settle into her body like sediment. The weight of all of it, the bathroom floor and the phone call and the penthouse and the corridors and the casino, the long, complex accumulation of a night and a day that had permanently altered the geography of her life. She was tired in a way that sleep was not going to fix quickly. But she was sitting upright in a chair in a building she'd gotten to under her own determination, and her wrist ached and her knees hurt from the casino carpet, and she had mildew somewhere on the back of her jacket. And she ran the assessment carefully, honestly, intact, deliberately, specifically intact. That mattered. She was still sitting there when Lucien appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd cleaned the cut above his eye. Tape over it now, applied with the no-nonsense precision of someone used to basic self-repair. And he'd changed his jacket for something hanging in the Meridian's closet that fit him well enough. He still looked like what the night had made him look like, which was exhausted in the bones-deep manner of sustained operational stress. But the compression had eased slightly. The density of the emergency mode concentration had thinned. He looked at her in the chair by the window for a moment. "There's food," he said. "I'll find it in a minute." He moved to the counter, found a glass, filled it. He stood at the sink with his back to her and drank. She watched the line of his shoulders, the specific quality of his stillness. "How is she?" Celine said. A pause. "Talking." He turned, leaned against the counter with the glass in his hand. "She's been talking to Caldera's people for 3 years. She said it started as listening. She knew someone he knew from before I brought her out of the rack. The connection predates everything I built, which means it predates my ability to have protected her from it." He said this flatly, not as a self-indictment, just as a timeline. By the time I had the resources to have noticed, it was already established. "Did she go looking for it?" Celine asked. "Or did he find her?" "He found her." A pause. I know it doesn't make it simple," she said. "I'm not asking for simple. I'm asking for accurate." He looked at her. Something in his face recognized the distinction. "He found her," he said again. "She was 23. She had my name and my connections and no other currency. He offered her security of a kind, the assurance that whatever happened between me and Caldera, she would be protected, buffered from it." He looked at the glass in his hand. "She believed him, which means she was 23 and she was afraid, and she believed a man who was using her, and I—" He stopped. "You," Celine said. "I was not paying the kind of attention that would have seen it," he said. "I was building, I was managing, I was doing the work of the thing I was building, and I made sure she had money and safety, and I thought that was sufficient." He said the last word with the specific weight of someone applying it to themselves as an indictment. "It was not sufficient." Celine was quiet for a moment. "She's going to need a long time," she said. "Yes, and you're going to need to let her have it instead of managing it." He looked at her, not offended, just looking with that flat, precise attention. "I know," he said. "Do you?" A pause. "I'm working on knowing," he said, which was, she thought, probably the most honest version of that answer. She stood up from the chair. Her legs ached. She went to the counter and found a section of it to lean against and stood about 4 feet from him, which was the distance she'd observed him maintain from people he wasn't certain about, and which she was choosing deliberately now, consciously offering the space back to him as a thing she understood rather than a thing she was simply
receiving. What happens now? She said. With Caldera.
He pulled back tonight, but he didn't finish. He'll regroup and he'll come at the financial structure. He doesn't have the manpower for another direct approach. Not after tonight. He turned the glass once in his hand. Federal investigators have been building a case for 14 months. Caldera's operation has enough exposure from tonight's events that the case timeline is going to accelerate. His associates are going to start making pragmatic decisions about loyalty. He paused. It will fall.
Not instantly, but it will fall.
How do you know? Because I'm going to help it, he said, simply. Information, documentation, logistical assistance to the right people with the right authority, things I've been positioned to provide for some time, but haven't had adequate motivation to provide. She looked at him. Motivation. Incentive, he said, and then, after a moment, reason. She heard the weight of the replacement, the progression from the operational word to the honest one.
And your operation, she said. What happens to it? He was quiet for a moment. A genuine one. Not the waiting before an answer kind, but the actually considering kind.
Some of it ends, he said. Some of it converts. There are parts of what I've built that are infrastructure, essentially. Routes, relationships, systems. Some of those systems move things that hurt people, which has been a calculation I've made differently at different points in the last 7 years, and which I'm going to make differently going forward. He said this without performance, without the quality of a man trying to impress someone with his own reformation. Just the statement of a decision that had apparently been made at some point tonight and been made quietly. Some of it was always legitimate underneath. That part expands. That's not nothing, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. She looked at him for a long moment, at the scar on his jaw and the tape above his eye and the careful, precise hands on the glass and the quality of a face that had been built hard and had not been unmade by the hardness, but had been... She searched for the word and found it. Marked, not broken. Marked. Tell me something true, she said, that you haven't told me yet. He looked at her with what she'd started to recognize as his most direct expression. Not the flat professional assessment, not the managed emotion version, but the face he made when he'd decided to stop performing any version of himself and just answer from wherever he actually was. The night you called, he said. Juno's phone. I was in the middle of something I won't describe to you, something I had been completely certain I was going to do, that I had done before, that is part of the work of what I am. He paused. Your voice came through and everything else stopped. Not because of who you were. I didn't know who you were. Because of the sound of it. He looked at the counter. I have heard a great many people frightened. I have caused a great many people to be frightened. That sound does not typically... He stopped. Restarted. It was different. Beach City. The kitchen was very quiet. I don't know what that means, he said. I know what it felt like. I know what I did because of it. He looked up at her. I don't have a clean version of myself to offer you. I want to be straightforward about that. Whatever I'm building toward, the thing I'm coming from is what it is, and I'm not going to pretend it was something else. I know what you are, she said. Most people think they do, he said. Then they find out more specifically, and they revise. I've had a comprehensive orientation, she said, 48 hours of it. Something crossed his face. It took her a moment to identify it because she hadn't seen it on him before. It was humor. Not performed, not social, just real, brief, the involuntary kind that happens when something lands before the defenses can decide whether to let it. You have, he admitted. And I'm still standing in your kitchen, she said. You can note that. He noted it. She could see him noting it. She could see it doing something to the structure of whatever he'd been holding, not dissolving it, nothing that quick or easy, but shifting it, the way weight shifts when something is redistributed. He set the glass down on the counter, and they stood 4 feet apart in a kitchen in the Meridian building at some hour past 2 a.m., while the city outside did whatever it was doing with the night's events, and neither of them moved yet, and neither of them needed to yet, because they were two people who had been through a significant amount of fire in a short period, and the fire had burned away most of the excess, and what was left was very clear and didn't require rushing. She thought, I had a bus ticket. She thought, I had a plan. She thought, plans are guesses mostly. The morning came in increments. She slept finally in the Meridian bedroom with the door locked from the inside, which was not a statement about trust, but a habit she intended to keep for a while because it was hers, and because it belonged to her, and because the maintenance of certain small autonomous choices mattered more to her now than it ever had. She slept for 6 hours, which was not enough, and was also more than she'd expected to manage. When she woke, the apartment was quieter than it had been. Different. The operational frequency that had been running through every room since the penthouse had dropped to something lower, steadier. Normal was not the word. Nothing about the situation was normal. But the emergency register had passed. She found Juno in the main room, not on the couch this time. At the window, standing, looking out at the city with her arms wrapped around herself and her coffee in her hand. She'd showered. She'd found clean clothes from somewhere. She looked, from behind, like the version of herself that Celine had known for 2 years. And then she turned when she heard Celine's footsteps, and she looked like what she actually was, which was a person who had been through a night that had extracted a full accounting. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Her face was raw with the specific quality of someone who has cried themselves clean past the dramatic versions into the quiet ones, and has come out the other side into a kind of stripped clarity. They looked at each other. Celine crossed the room and stood beside her at the window. Outside, Blackwater City was doing its morning thing. Traffic on the lower roads, the harbor barely visible through the early haze, a delivery truck double-parked on the block below, while a man moved boxes with the uncomplicated efficiency of someone whose day had not included anything from the previous night's ledger. "I don't know where to start," Juno said. Her voice was quiet and even and tired. "You don't have to start yet," Celine said. "I need to." "You need to eat something first," Celine said. "Then start." Juno looked at her. Her eyes filled slightly, and she blinked it back with the practiced control of someone who has decided, for the time being, to be done with crying. "I introduced you to him on purpose," Juno said. It came out plain, no inflection, the statement of a woman who had decided that the only currency she had left was accuracy. "I'd been watching you for 2 months before that, where you worked, your schedule. Caldera wanted someone specific, isolated, but not visibly isolated, self-sufficient, the kind of person who wouldn't be looked for immediately if she disappeared." She paused. "You matched exactly." Celine kept her eyes on the window. "I told myself I was going to watch how it went," Juno continued, "that I'd stop it before anything actually happened, that it was just information. Dax was already working with Caldera, so the introduction was just connecting things that already existed." She wrapped her hands tighter around the coffee mug. "I told myself that right up until the moment I started actually being your friend. And then I kept telling myself it anyway, because stopping meant telling Lucien. Man," Celine said. "Means losing everything," Juno said. "The protection Caldera had given me. Lucien's trust. You." She stopped. "I kept trying to find an exit that didn't cost everything, and there wasn't one, and months kept going, and I kept being my friend," Celine said. "Yes." The word came out broken and whole at the same time. Celine stood with that for a moment. The full double nature of it, that Juno had been real while also being constructed, that the friendship had been initiated as scaffolding and had become something Juno hadn't planned for and couldn't undo and hadn't wanted to lose and had not been able to protect in the end from either direction. "The night I called your phone," Celine said, "did you know Dax was going to—" "No." Fast. Clear. "No, I knew he was in trouble with Caldera. I knew the debt was bad, but I didn't know what he was going to do that night. When Lucien picked up your call, I was—" She swallowed. "I was in the next room. I heard everything. And you didn't stop him from going." "I couldn't have stopped him," Juno said. "You know what he is." "I know what he is," Celine agreed. "I'm asking if you tried." A pause. "I stood in the hallway," Juno said, "while he gave the order, and I didn't say anything." She set the coffee mug on the windowsill because her hands were shaking slightly and the mug was at risk. "That's the one I'm going to have to live with." The silence between them had weight, not the hostile kind, more like the weight of something real being held between two people who are deciding together what to do with it. "I'm not going to tell you it's okay," Celine said, "because it's not okay, and you know it's not okay, and saying it would insult you." She turned from the window and looked at Juno directly. But I'm also not going to tell you who you are from here, because that's yours. You figure that out. She paused. What I will tell you is that the 2 years were real. Not all of them, not the beginning of them, not the machinery underneath them. But what we actually were to each other in those years was real. And I know the difference between a performance and the actual thing, and what you gave me was the actual thing, even while you were also giving me the other thing. She let that land. I don't forgive what you did, but I see who you are alongside it, and those are two separate things that can both be true.
Juno was very still. That's more than I... She stopped. That's more than I came to this window expecting. Yeah, Celine said. They stood together in the quiet. The days that followed moved differently than the days before them.
Federal investigators came to Blackwater with the energy of people who had been waiting for a door to open and had found it significantly ajar. The documentation that Lucian's network provided moved timelines up by weeks, and the Caldera organization, which had been operating under various surface names for nearly a decade, began losing its structural coherence as the men at its edges made the calculations that men at edges always make when the center stops looking certain. Roman Caldera disappeared for 11 days. He was found on the 12th, not violently, not dramatically, sitting in a rental car outside a diner in a city 200 miles from Blackwater, waiting for a meeting with a man who had already agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors. He was arrested at the table. He did not resist. He looked, according to the federal agent who processed his paperwork, like a man who had been tired for a very long time and had finally arrived somewhere he could stop. She read this in a brief item in the city's second-tier news outlet, and she sat with it for a while, and then she filed it in the category of things that were resolved and moved on. Dax Mercer cooperated. This surprised her less than she expected it to. She had spent 2 years believing she could see Dax clearly and had been wrong about the important things. But the small assessment she had made of him in the casino, the man who runs out of calculations, who has been running the angles so long that he's forgotten there are angles he can't run, that one had been accurate. He gave the federal investigators everything he had, which turned out to be considerable, because Dax had always collected information the way some people collect objects, as a form of security that ultimately became its own kind of weight. He went into witness protection in a city she was not told the name of, and she thought about him exactly once after that, in the specific contained way of someone who has decided to think about something once, completely, and then not again. Lucien dismantled portions of his empire that she knew about, and several portions she didn't know about until afterward, when Cord mentioned them in passing with the tone of a man reporting a weather event that had already passed. Legitimate businesses absorbed the operational infrastructure. Port routes that had moved things that hurt people were closed and documented, and the documentation went to people who needed it. Some of his men found other arrangements. Some stayed with what he was building in the new direction. Cord stayed, which she took as a form of endorsement that carried weight precisely because Cord was not a man who stayed out of sentiment. It took months. None of it was clean. None of it was the kind of transformation that made for a simple before and after. It was incremental and costly, and several things went wrong in the middle of it, and there were weeks in which Lucien was essentially unreachable, operating at the compressed frequency of a man untangling something that had been knotted for years. She understood this. She did not require the simplicity of a clean transformation. She had not come from something simple herself. She found an apartment, not on Crail Street. That part of her life was done. Its geography too saturated with the specific weight of 2 years she was not interested in revisiting through proximity. The new apartment was on the north side, 3 blocks from the waterfront, with a window that showed a piece of the harbor if you stood at the right angle, which she did sometimes in the evenings when she was thinking about things. She began slowly and then less slowly to understand what she was going to do next. The women she'd met through Caldera's operation, the ones who'd survived it, who were trying to navigate the aftermath of having been in it, needed things that the city's existing infrastructure was not well positioned to provide. She knew this not as an abstract principle, but as a specific operational gap, because she had spent time with some of them during the federal investigation process and had watched them bounce off systems that were not designed with their particular situation in mind. She started building something, small at first. A contact network, a set of relationships with the people who could help, and the institutions that could be leveraged. She was methodical about it in a way that surprised her, and then didn't surprise her, because she'd had a comprehensive education in the last year about what methodical actually looked like when it was applied by someone who meant it. Lucian found the funding before she asked him for it. She found out about this when Cord mentioned it, again in the tone of weather, and she called Lucien and said, "The funding." "Yes," he said. "You didn't ask me. I was going to tell you." "When?" "When it was operationally relevant," he said, and she heard the deliberate echo of her own words from the morning at the table, months ago, and something in her chest moved in the way it had been occasionally moving since the casino. "Don't do that again," she said. "Tell you about funding. Make decisions about my things without telling me first." A pause. A genuine one. "That's a fair requirement," he said. "I know it's fair. I'm not asking for your assessment. I'm telling you the requirement." Another pause, and she could hear him on the other end of the line doing the things she'd watched him do in person. The recalibration, the acknowledgement that arrived not as capitulation, but as actual reception. Like something had been said, and he had heard it and was making room for it. "Understood," he said. "Good," she said. And then, because it was also true, "Thank you for the funding." The building that became the Celine Vey Resource Center, though she didn't name it that was what people eventually called it. She called it simply the Center. Was 3 stories on a corner 2 blocks from the harbor. It was not beautiful from the outside, which was fine. Some of the most important things in Blackwater had never been beautiful from the outside. She spent 4 months getting it ready, which was not long enough and was the time she had, and she made it work with the time she had. Staff hired for competence and survived it before credential. A hotline that was answered by humans. 3 counselors whose primary qualification was that they understood the specific landscape of having had your choices made for you for a significant period and were skilled at the particular delicate work of helping someone reclaim the territory of their own decisions. A small legal clinic 2 days a week. A room with a lock on the door that nobody asked you to open. On the night before the opening, she stood in the empty main room of the center by herself and looked at what existed in the space where nothing had existed before, and she held it for a while. She thought about the duffel bag, the 4 months of skimmed tips, the bus ticket to Callaway Port, folded and creased, that had been for a life that was going to be hers in the limited way of someone starting from zero. She had started from zero anyway, just not the zero she'd planned on. She turned off the light and locked the door and walked the 2 blocks to the harbor and stood at the railing and looked at the water, which was black and cold and moving with the specific perpetual indifference of something that predates everything happening on its edges and will outlast it. She heard footsteps. She knew the sound of them. She had been learning the sound of them for 7 months, and she knew them now the way you know certain sounds that have become part of the furniture of your daily life, things you'd notice immediately by their absence. Lucien stopped beside her at the railing. He was not wearing a jacket, which she'd stopped arguing with him about because he clearly was not going to change, and Blackwater's winters were not going to change. And at some point, continued engagement on the topic became futile. He had no guards with him tonight, which was a thing that had become less unusual as the months had passed and the landscape had changed, and what he was had shifted enough that the guards were becoming less the point. He looked at the water. She looked at the water. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she confirmed. "How do you feel?" She turned the question over, gave it the consideration it deserved. "Like I'm about to open a door," she said, "and I don't know exactly what's on the other side, but I know it's what's supposed to be there." He nodded. He was quiet in the specific way he was quiet when he was not managing the quiet, but just existing in it, which was a quality she had been watching develop across 7 months. The incremental appearance of a man underneath the operational surface, the slow emergence of someone who had been compressed into function for so long that the expansion was cautious and sometimes halting, but was real. "I went back to the rack last month," he said. She looked at him. "First time in 4 years," he said. He looked at the water. "There's a block on the south end. It's the same. Everything about it is the same buildings and the same smell and the same quality of light, which is wrong somehow, not enough of it, like the city has been stingy with it for that specific block for 30 years. He paused. "I used to think about that block as the thing I was running from, the thing I was making sure I never went back to." He turned the thought over. "Went there last month and it just looked like a block. like a place where people live and it's hard and it shouldn't be that hard. And the reason it's that hard is a set of decisions made by people with power who found it convenient to look another direction. He paused. It's not my origin story. It's a block that needs something done about it. She looked at him. What are you going to do about it? She said. Something in his face did the thing she'd been watching it learn to do. Not the controlled professional surface, not the managed version, but the face of someone who is in the early stages of becoming legible to himself and is not entirely comfortable with the process, but is not stopping it. I don't know yet, he said. I'm figuring out what I'm doing about things as I go. He paused. That is not my natural operating mode. I know, she said. I'm told it's a process, he said, with the careful inflection of someone quoting back language they've been given by a person they trust. Who told you that? She said. You did, he said, 4 months ago, in the kitchen. She had in fact said something like that, and the fact that he had held it for 4 months and produced it now, clean and exact, told her something about how he carried things, not lightly, but carefully. She turned back to the harbor. The water moved. The city behind them made its nighttime sounds, traffic, distant music from somewhere, a boat horn from the docks, the ordinary audio of a place that had been through a significant amount and had not stopped being a place. Blackwater City did not resolve into simple things. It had not been simple before the events of the previous year, and it was not simple now, and she did not expect it to become simple because cities of this particular character did not become simple. They accumulated and processed and continued, and the people in them either got crushed by the accumulation or learned to move inside it. She had learned to move inside it. Lucian's hand found hers on the railing, not with urgency or statement, just a hand finding another hand in the dark, with the quiet certainty of something that has been decided over time rather than in a moment, that does not need to announce itself because it has already been established through the accumulation of months and corridors and kitchens and loading areas, and the specific education of going through a significant amount together and coming out knowing the other person with the kind of accuracy that you only get from the hard versions of closeness. She turned her hand over, held it back. The harbor smelled like salt and cold, and the particular Blackwater blend of industry and weather that she'd been smelling her whole life and had stopped noticing until she'd nearly left, and now noticed again as the specific scent of the place where she was from and where she was staying, and where, it turned out, the thing she was building needed to be built. You could have disappeared, she said. When the federal investigation started, you had the infrastructure. You could have been gone. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. Why didn't you? He turned it over. She watched him turn it over, the careful consideration of someone who is giving a question the honesty it's asking for. Because I spent my whole life, he said, building things that were mine by force, things that existed because I made them exist through a specific kind of will, and they lasted as long as my will lasted, and they required constant maintenance of the kind that doesn't allow, he paused, that doesn't allow anything else. She waited. Then one night something happened differently, he said. Something came to me instead of the other way. Not because I'd built toward it, not because I'd calculated it, just it came. And I made a decision in about 2 seconds that I hadn't planned to make, and the decision turned out to be the one that mattered. He looked at the water. I'm not leaving something that I didn't build by force. She listened to the water moving below the railing. That's the reason, she said. That's the reason, he said. The snow that came later that winter came down in the particular Blackwater way of it. Not dramatic, not blizzard, just a slow, quiet presence, flakes moving sideways in the harbor wind, accumulating on surfaces with the patient indifference of something that has all the time it needs. She stood outside the center on the evening of its 3rd month open and watched it fall. 43 women had come through in those 3 months. 43 women who had found the number, or been given it, or had walked past the building and seen the light on inside, which was a thing she had decided from the beginning, that the light would be on inside whenever there was someone in the building, because there were people in this city who navigated toward lit windows the way people navigated toward certain sounds, and she wanted to be a lit window. 43 was not a large number in the context of what the city needed. It was 43 more than there had been. She stood in the snow and thought about the woman on the bathroom floor 10 months ago. The woman with the split lip and the throbbing wrist, and the phone against her ear and the bus ticket in a bag that had been thrown against a wall. She thought about that woman with the specific quality of closeness that comes from having been her recently enough to remember the texture of the cold tile through the denim. And she thought about what that woman had needed and had not been able to name yet. And she thought, there is a room in this building with a lock on the door that nobody asks you to open, and that is the beginning of an answer. Footsteps on the salted sidewalk. She knew them. Lucien came and stood beside her outside the center and looked at the building and at the lit windows on its 3 floors and at the small, unremarkable sign by the door that said the center's name and the hours and the phone number. He looked at all of this for a moment with the same quality of attention he gave to things he found worth examining carefully. "It's good," he said. "Not evaluating, just stating." "Yeah," she said. He looked at her. The snow was settling on both of them with the democratic indifference of weather, dusting his shoulders, catching in her hair, and the streetlight above them made everything amber and close, and the harbor was 2 blocks away. And behind it, Blackwater City did its perpetual complex thing, living and grinding and accumulating the way it always had. He reached out and brushed the snow from her hair with his hand. One gesture, simple and complete, the kind of gesture that contains everything a person has decided without needing to say any of it out loud. She looked at him in the amber light, at the scar on his jaw that was old now, and had been old when she'd met him, and would always be there, a fixed star in the geography of his face. At the place above his eye where the cut had healed clean, no mark remaining, just smooth skin over the place where the night had gotten through. At the face of a man who had been built from terrible things, and had decided, somewhere in the middle of a year, that had extracted a full accounting from both of them, to build something different from what came next. She thought, I called the wrong number. She thought, there is no such thing. Come inside, she said. It's cold. I'm fine, he said. You're freezing, she said. You're always freezing and you never admit it. Come inside. Something crossed his face. The humor again, the involuntary kind, brief and real. He came inside. The door closed behind them. The snow kept falling on Blackwater City with the patience of something that doesn't need to be noticed to do its work, settling on the streets and the harbor and the rooftops and the sign outside the center that said the hours and the number, covering over the old marks of things that had happened, filling in the places where something had been and was no longer, making the city, for one quiet hour, entirely and impermanently white, clean, not forgiven, not forgotten, but clean, the way things get clean after a long time of being otherwise, slowly and from the outside in, and by the accumulation of small, quiet things rather than by any single transforming act. And inside the lit building on the corner 2 blocks from the harbor, the light stayed on.